Okay, so I'm here with my old friend, we'll call him Kay, and we're going to be talking today about an article and a video that I recently created about justice and violence, the relationship between justice and violence, or more specifically, the ideal of justice and the reality of the violence in life. I'm going to start just by reading a quote. This is a quote from Nietzsche, from Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. And this is the quote that kind of sparked my interest in these topics. So, okay, I will read the quote and then I'll summarize very briefly my article, and then we can jump into it. And I'd love to hear what you have to think about it. So, here's the quote from Nietzsche. To speak of just or unjust in itself is quite senseless. In itself, of course, no injury, assault, exploitation, destruction can be unjust, since life operates essentially, that is, in its basic functions, through injury, assault, exploitation, destruction, and simply cannot be thought of at all without this character. One must indeed grant something even more unpalatable, that, from the highest biological standpoint, legal conditions can never be other than exceptional conditions, since they constitute a partial restriction of the will to life, of the will of life, which is bent upon power, and are subordinate to its total goal as a single means, namely, as a means of creating greater units of power. A legal order thought of as sovereign and universal, not as a means in the struggle between power complexes, but as a means of preventing all struggle in general, this would be a principle hostile to life, an agent of the dissolution and destruction of man, an attempt to assassinate the future of man, a sign of weariness, a secret path to nothingness. So when I read this quote, it really got me thinking about how to deal with this dilemma of the value of justice and the reality of the violence of life, and also particularly how our society thinks about it. So I wrote this article and I eventually created a video around this and distinguished a few different positions that I think are out there. So the first one is what you hear from Nietzsche in this quote, which you could call like the Nietzschean or the vitalist affirmation of life with its violence. The opposite extreme, which he alludes to at the end, you could call a kind of nihilistic, moralistic denial of life. Life is not even worthwhile. Life is evil because of its violence. And then a few other positions that are a bit more nuanced. So Christianity is sort of seeing the immanent as infused with or potentially transformed by the transcendent. So they're not ultimately at odds, the idea being that the world was created perfect and will one day be made perfect again. So there's not a ontological difference between life and justice. It's just that the fallen world is like this. That's the Christian position. And then there's other positions as well, like the Hindu position. And I also link in the thought of Simone Weil in this as well. A kind of acceptance of both immanence and transcendence, an acceptance of life as it is with its violence, but also, unlike Nietzsche, or at least in my reading of Nietzsche, affirmation of the transcendent, of the divine, of the spiritual as well. But the key thing in this view is that they are separate. They don't come together. The transcendent doesn't change or transform the immanent. And then the position of transhumanism, which is perhaps ultimately a confused position, but this would be the notion of humans transforming the immanent based on their ideals. So it's still immanent, but it's not this vitalist immanence of Nietzsche. So we would say that we want to remake the universe as we would like it to be. We want to change nature. And maybe if we're more ethically oriented, we want to eliminate predation among animals. We want to eliminate suffering as much as possible. Whether this can even be achieved, whether this is even desirable, is a different question, and I think that's what makes it somewhat confused of a position. And then finally, what I see as just being the modern de facto confused state of thought around this, which is essentially not a worked out coherent position, but which kind of says, yes, we passionately believe in universal justice, and yet we also disbelieve in transcendence. We only believe in the immanent world. We only believe in material reality. There's a contradiction there. We can come back to that one. But those are the positions that I outlined. So firstly, and I know this is a long introduction, but I want to throw it over to you. So firstly, to go back to the quote, to speak of just or unjust in itself is quite senseless, since life operates essentially through injury, assault, exploitation, and destruction. How would you respond to that? Is there such a thing as justice in itself? Or is life essentially will to power? How do you think about the relationship between justice and the violence of life?
Well, I think there's a little more room for nuance than that. I mean, by and large, I actually just agree with the quote. I don't know how you can... I guess my thought on that would be, I don't know what a universal or cosmic justice could or would mean. It seems to me that justice is kind of outwardly oriented, like it has a discrete social function. And so that's why when we go to talk about justice in relation to the natural world, say, it kind of stops making sense. And I think a universal justice is kind of incoherent in the same way.
Because justice arises out of societies. You have to have societies in order to have justice.
Well, you basically have to have aggrieved parties and perpetrators, and I don't think those things exist on the cosmic level. And I don't really think that the religious answers to this, except maybe in their most crude form, actually have an identity with justice as Nietzsche is referring to it here. I don't think that, like, say, the Christian position, if you take it deeply, I don't think it relates to the conventional human understanding of justice.
So let's. I want to just pick up something you said about nature doesn't have aggrieved parties. So what do you mean by that exactly? Is it the sense that because obviously there
No,
is...
I think within nature there are billions of aggrieved parties, but I don't think nature as a whole can be aggrieved. Environmentalists might beg to differ, but.
Because someone might look at a predator-prey relationship, for instance, and they might say, well, this is the victim. Say this is the victim, and this is the being that is being tormented or killed or whatever. There's a lack of justice in the natural world. Would you say it would you see it in those terms, or would you say justice just doesn't apply?
Yeah, I would say that there's an absence of justice, but that's because it's completely incoherent to speak of justice in the natural world.
Right, so that's what I was getting at. Like, it's not just injustice, but it's just that justice doesn't apply. It's not coherent to apply it to the natural world.
Yeah, because
it's neither just or unjust, essentially.
Yeah, I would say plants and animals and so forth don't seek justice. Humans seek justice because that's our way of conceptualizing, essentially getting even with the parties that wrong us.
So the animal that is being sort of eaten alive or something, it's wanting to escape its suffering, right? But it's not wanting anything like a human being would want in terms of justice with its, in regard to its...
Well, I mean, maybe it is. Maybe, the animal that's being eaten alive, if it's a relatively sophisticated animal, perhaps it wants to inflict great pain on the animal that's eating it, right? Just like a human being in the legal system might want to inflict great pain on the person that wronged them. But the animal doesn't dress it up with, this kind of socialized layer.
Because that's something... That's something more instinctual, isn't it? Like that desire for vengeance is not quite the notion of justice. It's close, it's related, but it's not exactly the notion of justice.
Well, I think that is actually what lies behind
justice.
It's just that for social reasons we can't openly speak of vengeance, at least in the kind of society we're in now. Yeah, so we've developed a quite complicated workaround. We've abstractified it.
So would you say that what kind of reality does justice have? That would be one way to ask this. So what I mean by that is, so you in the quote, Nietzsche talks about justice in itself, and I take it from your answer that you don't believe in justice in itself, in the sense of something that's somehow independent of human societies, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, what could that mean? Perhaps my conception of justice is just too limited, but what could that mean?
Well, justice is a difficult term, so I mean, especially when we talk about it in terms of an opposition with violence, and maybe this is begging the question, but we would think of justice as being the absence of violence. So sort of those words that Nietzsche uses: injury, assault, exploitation, destruction.
Justice is just the absence of all of that?
Or at least it's minimally the absence of that. And so you can imagine like a perfectly peaceful universe, something like that, something like you see a glimpse of in the book of Isaiah or the beginning of Genesis, right? All creatures living together without predation, something like that might be what people conceive of as justice in relation to the.
I find that interesting because I think that's not, when you talk about the judicial system or human justice between parties, between real human parties, it's very, very different from that. It doesn't say everybody goes home into a state of kind of perfect stasis where there's no conflict ever. The system itself is agonistic, and we want it that way. We think it's better. We think our system is better that way rather than a system that just dispenses total judgments that foreclose any kind of human discretion.
So by agonistic, you mean what? It's got this sort of dynamism that can keep going, like litigation can keep going and going?
Yeah, and litigation exists. I mean, it's not just this judge on high that hands down,
Yeah, so again, that sort of dynamism, that sense that this is not like rooted in some absolute,
Yeah, you're
judgment.
Also not morally obligated, in a sense, to actually accept the judgment. You have to accept it legally. I mean, otherwise there are material consequences. But you're not. I would say you're not really asked to accept it morally. It has looked at. Lawyers probably look at it this way. It has no real moral grounding.
Yeah, so there's a distinction between like legal right and sort of like moral right.
Yeah, perhaps the consequences have moral import. Like it would be, consequentially speaking, it would be destructive for us to act as though law had no, binding power, or as though it meant nothing. But really, you're not. It's not what's asked of you. You're usually asked to go to prison or pay a fine or so forth. Yeah. So I think that's pretty different from universal peace or like, the eschaton or something.
Right. So in terms of like the reality of justice, then it sounds like you would sort of be on the side of the spectrum of, it's rooted in complex human drives, complex social realities. It's not necessarily a very distinct thing that you can point to.
Yeah, I would say it's quite deeply rooted. I think it's instinctual. I think we have a sense of justice, but it's something that's a little bit hard to pin down because when the shoe is on the other foot, that tends to go out the window. Both for better and for worse, I would say. And that perhaps someone in a very strong position actually has less need of justice.
Okay. Because the reason I'm sort of asking these questions is to, I guess, you could have a sort of a complete nominalism of justice, if that makes sense, which is sort of like justice is just a name for this collection of practices or whatever, right? So, for instance, it's partly a manifestation of vengeance, or it's, let's say, the manifestation of vengeance mitigated or channeled by the need to have a coherent society that sticks together, something like that, right? Would you be closer to that view than say something like justice is this almost Platonic form that you can kind of point to?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I think the description you gave is pretty fair. And I actually think, maybe this doesn't add much, but I think the average person would probably accept something like that as a definition.
Interesting.
For better or worse.
Interesting.
If you really push them on it,
Okay, we might loop back to that one, because I think that could be interesting to talk about with regard to the modern view of this problem. But I want to ask another question, because another way that I conceive of this that I talked about in my video, in my article, was instead of talking about the relation just between justice and violence of life, I talked about the difference between, or the relationship between the transcendent and the immanent, sort of as a more general relationship between these two. So I'm interested in how you would see this relationship. So is for instance, in your view of things, is everything immanent? Is there no transcendent? Is there also a transcendent? And if so, how do they relate to each other?
Well, that's a difficult question.
And obviously these are very broad words, so we may need to define them more. But what's your initial...
my initial impulse is just not to take a very firm position on it, because I don't know what any particular... I don't know exactly what you mean by the transcendent in this case.
So, I mean, and this is part of the problem, is that the words are very broad. But let's relate it to the Nietzsche quote and what we've been talking about. So the immanent in this case would be life, and the way that life actually operates, right? That's immanent because it's there. We can observe it, we can see it, and we can actually experience it ourselves, in as much as we are vital organisms, right? We understand the desire to avoid pain, to seek pleasure, maybe even to obtain vengeance if that's relevant to us. So all of this is immanent, and then the transcendent would be something like that which our higher impulses are oriented to, or our higher intentions is maybe a better but maybe more technical word. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if we are seeking truth for its own sake, typically that would be considered a transcendent thing, that we're transcendent value, let's say, that we're oriented towards. So not instrumentally, not just to control and predict nature, but truth for its own sake, let's say. Or potentially beauty is often put in this category as well, right? To contemplate beauty for its own sake. Beauty is something transcendent. And then the most obvious one would be ethical goodness, or right, or right in the sense that comes into this question of justice. There is a right way for beings to relate to each other, and that this is transcendent, and when we're seeking it, we're oriented in that transcendent way. But do you think that exists at all, or do you think all this can be reduced to the immanent?
Well, I don't want to say it can be reduced, but I am a little bit resistant to the framing, because I think all those things are also immanent, are they not? I mean, these aren't things that you can't directly access. Whether there are things which are immanent but have great depth behind them, which you could call transcendence, I'm open to that kind of framing. But to say something like beauty isn't also immanent, even truth. I mean, otherwise, how else do we perceive it? Is it like is it that we shift our attention off everything that appears to be real, and then we discover the truth? We shift our attention off everything that appears to be appealing or aesthetically engaging, and then we find real beauty. I don't really believe that.
Right, because
I think you go through.
When you're talking about beauty, it's something that's very much there. it's something that you experience. It's something that maybe you very forcefully experience, and typically we would experience it in at least works of art, and obviously, you know, in attractive people as well. Although that maybe rides the line with like vital instincts. But anyway, the point being that let's take a more pure example, which is like a work of art, right? That the beauty is there, it's manifest. That's what you're saying. It's not hidden in some secret world.
I would say so. I would say the beauty is, it operates on different levels, but on one level it's kind of ignorant. On one level it's just self-evident. I don't know that a great work of art is inaccessible to someone who doesn't perceive the, you know. But that's an interesting question. Is a great work of art inaccessible to someone who doesn't perceive the transcendent truth behind it, or the genius mind behind it, or the meaning? Well, or is the meaning in some sense in the art?
Does the meaning contribute to the beauty in your view?
I think it could, but I wouldn't go as far as saying that somebody who can't articulate or kind of structure the meaning behind it into a coherent kind of thought or philosophy can't enjoy or experience the art.
So let's take that example where someone, let's say, isn't intellectually sophisticated. They're not an art critic or something like that, but they can clearly experience the beauty of an artwork.
But I mean, are art critics?
Well, art critics today, I would say, are probably the least trustworthy in terms of helping us appreciate beauty. Yeah. But that's a different story. But let's just take an average person, and let's like use a more classical example of an artwork. So we're not thinking of something massively sophisticated like a contemporary piece of.
Well, I mean, is it sophisticated again?
Well, yes, sophisticated or just, you know. But let's take something that, you know, maybe a piece of Renaissance art or something like that, which typically, it seems to me, people can just look at and say, wow, that is magnificent, that is beautiful, and they have a sense of that. So you're saying, you know, that is present, that is something that's in their reality, and so we shouldn't talk about it as transcendent. Is that fair to say so far before I go on?
Well, what I mean is, I think it's complicated to tease apart which aspect of that you might refer to as the transcendent, because it's, as you say, it's immediate to the human mind, spirit.
And in that sense, everything that we experience is going to be immanent, right? Is that
I'm not like, I am curious as to what it really means. I mean, I genuinely want to understand where you draw the line. Do you see the problem?
I do see the problem, and it is hard to draw the line, especially with something like beauty, which is something that could actually have physiological effects on us, right? Like, it's not something that is just sort of in the mind, but it's something that can overwhelm people. I guess where I would say that there's a sense of the transcendent is that beauty, it's very hard to situate it in a scientific picture of the world.
Well, could I offer maybe a different way of putting that?
Sure.
I think if we can speak about the transcendent, maybe it's that element of experience that actually destroys.
Okay. Destroys.
Yeah, as in I can be a person, I can appreciate art. It does have an immediate, imminent effect on me. I don't have to know anything. I don't have to have any ideas about anything, I would say, almost. But if that art were so powerful, or that experience was so powerful that my subjectivity, my ego, my sense of who I am started to dissolve in its presence, perhaps that's another layer of experience of reality. Maybe that denotes something else.
So that might be for you, maybe where the transcendent comes into the picture.
Yeah, and like I have no inherent objection to that dichotomy. I'm just trying to find a real thing that I can hold on to where I can say this is the immanent and this is the transcendent.
Right. So something that undermines one's sense of self or distinctness from the universe, something like that.
Yeah, I would say so, but I would have to add the caveat that, you know, I'm the one suggesting this, but I also think it's quite a stupid way to do it, but maybe it's correct.
a stupid way to...
I think it's a stupid way to try and discover the transcendent, because I think, well, from the perspective of, say, reified philosophy, because I think you would have to include some very down to earth things, because you're talking about the immanent as being, the initial example we started with kind of makes reference to like the jungle, say, or
Yes.
the charnel ground,
Yes.
Predation and so forth.
Yeah.
Those things must also be an opening to the transcendent, because I can't
Yes.
think of anything that destroys you
Yes.
more than being literally physically destroyed.
Absolutely. I guess the difference would be that if you can somehow be spiritually destroyed, let's say, I mean, it sounds very bad, but let's say you can be spiritually destroyed or
in
psychologically destroyed, and still continue to live,
Yep.
that's something quite unique.
Yep.
That's something that doesning happen to everything.
We may be
everyone.
foreshadowing where this is.
Yeah, well, because I'm thinking of Bay as I talk
yes,
about
but that
this,
is basically what I think. I think that's also in Nietzsche. Like, obviously, not to say, like, not to make a concrete assertion about what his relation might have been to, say, transcendence.
Yes.
Obviously had a relation to affliction, and he thought it was an opening to something.
So why do you say that? I'm interested. For Nietzsche, where do you see that coming into his philosophy?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a way of paraphrasing the idea of affirmation, because what are you affirming? You're not affirming the fact that life is easy and harmless. No. And you're affirming the fact that it destroys you.
Yes.
Even in life.
Yeah.
Even in life. You.
Yeah. So it's going to destroy you anyway.
Yeah.
Regardless, but it may also destroy you while you're still living. That's what you're saying. Like it did for him.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is really interesting to think about, because it's like, if Nietzsche knew that was coming, and he must have had an intimation that it was possible, would he still have affirmed? And did he?
He did. Isn't that? I mean, he tried to. Isn't that what his philosophy is? Isn't that what the kind of construct of eternal recurrences?
It's quite powerful to think about, because he suffered from those migraines and suffered from the sort of neurological symptoms throughout his life. He must have had some intimation that this was a possible outcome for him, a complete breakdown, a complete sort of break with reality. And when he was sort of working out the idea of the eternal return and working out this idea of fully affirming life as it is, it must have passed his mind that this was a possible outcome for him, and it may be that he explicitly affirmed that as well, and that was okay for him. Of course, elsewhere he talks about wanting to avoid that and the good death and so on and so forth, which presumably he would have pursued if he could have seen it coming and knew when it was going to happen.
And maybe we should.
And maybe we should. And yet he didn't, and maybe he still would have affirmed that life. I haven't read too much about his life, but from what I understand, his last maybe year or two was pretty ecstatic while he was writing all those books, and maybe that was the.
You mean his last year of sanity?
Yeah, his last year of
sanity. You're not including his.
Sorry, not of his life, but of his lucid life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a little, but I don't know if it's fruitful to go deeply into into the biographical aspects, I should say.
And yet Nietzsche emphasized that looking at philosophers' biographies and looking at their motivations and...
Well, yeah, I don't think we should completely eschew it. And what I would say is, I think the very last period of his life where he wasn't philosophically active...
Yes.
Isn't irrelevant.
No.
Yeah, that's all I would say. We don't know what it means because he couldn't write it down for us.
Well, that's very mysterious. Do you want to talk about that more?
Well, I just know it isn't irrelevant because I know
it was life after all.
It's life, yeah, and for an individual, especially someone of his, he's not someone who said, "Oh, write me off when I,"
Yes.
For someone of that temperament.
I mean, we have the insanity letters, which are obviously very early in that process. In terms of what happened after, I understand he kind of just degenerated into being more or less non-communicative.
But I know it was it was complicated in the sense that sometimes he was more lucid and sometimes he was less lucid.
I actually read that he remembered all the songs he could play on the piano and used to
so I don't know what to make of that. Maybe there was still joy, maybe there was still affirmation.
You would think so.
I think there was
those moments of of playing.
When there isn't, people actually often tend to just die.
Yes, yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So I guess for you, when we're talking about the transcendent versus the immanent, you see it as much more useful to talk about the immanent or talk about things in terms of immanence, but you don't want to write off the transcendent entirely. You would just see it, and tell me if this is accurate, you would just see it as being less obvious or accessible as people typically talk about, because it's something that comes into the picture when the self is compromised or dissolved.
Yeah, because I don't want to give the wrong idea. It's not that I'm like a partisan of immanence or something and I think it's better, or it's just that I'm wary of giving too much to that framing, because it makes it seem like, there's everyday life and there's everyday experiences and they have like a lesser value or lesser meaning.
Yes.
And then through some essentially magical process, you gain access to the higher world.
Yes.
I don't know if that's the case. That's the part that I don't want to agree to. Yes. Because that's not my experience.
And let's say the proponents of transcendence would see it something like this, Plato, for instance, presumably saw it something like, yes, I can break through to that transcendent realm and I can see the forms to some extent. And this is where morality is based. But obviously this is the very problem we're talking about. There's a huge problem with relating that to actual existence as it is.
I actually don't... that's essentially the view that on some level I'm rejecting. But I mean, obviously this is a huge aspect of Western thought. So I don't want to tangle with it too frivolously.
Absolutely. It's almost what it's based on this Platonic notion. I mean, Nietzsche would have seen it as that, more or less.
But it's really that phrasing it's that phrasing that I'm reacting to. You can't see the forms. No, I don't believe that.
Yeah. Because what are you seeing? What is it to see justice itself?
That's where I draw the line. And I don't know that the progenitors of this thought put it that way, but that's how people talk now. And that's what I reject.
Okay, fair enough. Yep. Because if someone's talking about justice in itself, and justice is really just a conglomeration of different impulses and different strategies and different social realities, then talking about justice in itself is always going to be misleading. It's always going to be something that people are just using strategically for a certain goal or a certain
what
purpose.
Good does it do?
Yeah.
What consequence does it have?
Right. I mean, potentially...
that's a real question.
Well, it motivates people. People say, I am doing this for the sake of justice, not for the sake of my interests.
Motivates people to what?
To action. I mean, people get outraged, or they,
And would you say that's good?
Well, I would say often it's not good. Often it leads to more disorder, but sometimes it can be good. It may be, especially, for instance, if you, let's take a hypothetical example. If you're seeing someone being victimized on the street, someone you have no relationship to, and someone that, in a situation where intervening would be at least somewhat dangerous to you, but you know that it's right to intervene and stop that aggression, maybe, potentially, that transcendent ideal of justice might just motivate you to do it, or might just push you over the line of doing it.
I don't think that sort of scenario, when it does, I mean, unfortunately, it often does not go that way. But I don't think that sort of scenario, when it does eventuate, is motivated by any kind of transcendent sense of justice. I think it's motivated by a very primate, instinctual
compassion or something.
Sense. Well, yeah, you could say compassion. That's maybe about as reified as you could get with it. But even just the sense that victimization is a threat to, my sense of self. Observing open, wanton victimization, it just doesn't sit well with people. I don't think that's because people have tapped into this.
Well, but potentially. I mean, I was just reading Girard, and obviously his view is that has changed throughout history, and so originally, actually, you might not have that reaction at all.
Well,
in
no,
fact,
that's what
you might join in potentially.
Yeah, well, you might now. That's what I'm saying. Is like, depending on context, you might feel this urge to get your own punch or kick in or whatever, steal something.
But your point is that
but you might not. You might feel the urge to attack a bully.
Exactly.
You might feel the urge to protect the weak, because in some sense that could be you.
And what we're talking about is urges. We're not. So what you're saying is that abstract notion of justice doesn't have much influence in these actual situations.
I don't believe so.
Yeah, because
you're not standing there. You're not standing there, kind of mustering a kind of abstracted, spiritualized perspective on the whole thing. You're just reacting.
Maybe Kant would have proceeded in that way, but he was a very unusual human being, so I don't think most people would be doing some kind of internal check to see.
Well, that's why his philosophy isn't a very good guide for anything.
Yeah.
It's interesting. But.
Yeah, because if you're standing there while someone's getting brutalized or something, and you're sort of doing some kind of moral calculus in your mind, then many people would say that you've kind of left morality behind already.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people would celebrate the person who acts. But then again, just to give the kind of dark mirror image of that, people also celebrate the person who jumps in on whatever can be construed as righteous violence or righteous, righteous violence. Like the person who sits on the fence because they're not sure that violence is the option is not often cast as the hero.
No.
Maybe decades later, but not often in the moment. You're just cast as a coward.
Yeah, especially if you are sitting on the fence, because at least if you're actively opposing it, even if that's not the socially acceptable thing to do at the time, you might become a hero eventually. Someone who just steps back and doesn't engage.
Well, it's individual physical cowardice, but it could also be treachery to your community, who by rights you should have more loyalty to than some outsider.
Yes. Okay. That's all very interesting, and I think I do get a sense of where you stand in relation to these opposites or whatever of transcendent and immanence. And part of what you're saying is you sort of resist using that dichotomy too much. It's not that helpful for you. But at the same time, it's not like you said, you're not a partisan of immanence. You're not just going to insist that everything is immanent or something like that. I want to jump to what people would typically see as the most transcendent thing, the most transcendent being, which would be God or the divine. So we're really kind of maxing that out. And I want to hear what you think about that, because you haven't ruled out the transcendent. And you've kind of referred to states which we can get into where that ego seems to be abolished or dissolved in some way. How would you say you believe in the divine? How would you define that, and or give some kind of indication to it?
Well, I think it's basically the same question put a different way. I don't know. Do you think that's fair? I think that's fair.
Well, yes, because again, it is the most extreme version of the transcendent. At least this is how I see it. It's the most transcendent.
Yeah, so I guess I would say something very unsatisfying, like perhaps you could identify the divine with that force that dissolves the individual subjectivity, or that substrate that perhaps you, air quotes, that perhaps you return to when you're in that state. So like when you're being destroyed, afflicted in life, or just confronted by overawing beauty or power. So if I acknowledge those states are real, I acknowledge that happens to people. It definitely happens to people, because I know people die, and I know that cannot be accounted for in normal everyday terms that we use.
Well, what do you mean by that? You know that people die, but that can't be accounted in normal.
Well, I mean, it is normal, but I know that we can't describe that experience. Yeah, we don't. So
the experience of dying.
Well, yeah, and we don't really ever have sufficient. To the degree that our normal life is modulated through language, say, whether death is outside of that.
Yeah,
because we can't talk about what's on the other side, really, other than in kind of poetic or mythological.
Well, a lot of people nowadays assume that it's just annihilation, so it'd be just like going to sleep or something like that.
Yeah, but that's not quite right. I mean, we can't.
Okay.
We don't actually have sufficient language for annihilation. Yeah, and so I suppose I just habitually somewhat identify that with what you could call living annihilation. With,
I want to push on this a little bit more, because maybe
well, what I was going to say ultimately is I believe those things are real. If that constitutes the divine, or perhaps just the outer reaches to the divine, or the entrance into the divine, then yeah, I believe in it. But like I say, on the other hand, I don't think we have a way of talking about this.
And yet we can maybe hint at it or get at it obliquely. I mean, you referred to the substrate. Is the divine the substrate of reality? The substrate.
Well, I don't want to commit to any particular phrasing because it has such strong kind of
and we'll say
material connotations.
We're not defining the divine, but we're pointing towards it or trying to hint at it or get at it obliquely.
Yeah, I think that's as far as anyone gets in language. Not to say it's not useful, perhaps the entire edifice of...
But is it useful to talk about the divine then in terms of the substrate, that which is beneath, that supports all beings?
It could be for some people, but for other people...
What about for you? Because it resonates with me as well. I don't want to exclude myself from that, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, that was the word I reached for, so
yes,
so maybe it does. But like I say, I really think we're just grasping when it comes to this.
Because you can also get the opposite language too, right? You can get the notion of the holy, H-O-L-Y, as the holy other, like W-H-O-L-L-Y, holy other. That which sort of overwhelms one with its otherness and alienness.
Well, I think I'm kind of saying that in a different way. That's what I mean about death.
Death it's both of those things, isn't it? Right? It's the holy other in the sense that it is completely not you. It's the thing that dissolves you, and yet it's also a kind of returning to the substrate, or there is, I guess, and we might be going too far afield on here, but in talking about the divine, but if we assume that ontologically all of reality is one, then there is a substrate in a sense, right? There's that one.
Absolutely, there's
that
something.
One unites me and you. It's the thing that stands beneath both me and you.
Yeah, I think that's why those words are at hand when I try and speak about this. And I don't know if this needs clarification, but to relate it back to what I was saying earlier, when it comes to, say, beauty, maybe just even great works of art and so forth, it seems to me that there's a difference between something you can consume and something that is perceived as greater than you, that overwhelms.
Yes.
Is like a surplus that cannot be accounted for.
Yes.
And in that sense, it's other, because it's not just you and your feelings and your sensual apprehension of something.
Yeah.
It's bigger than you. It's unaccountable. It's not reducible to your ego, and so
it's not an object for you either, really. Yeah. And in fact, it can maybe make you an object for it in a way.
Well, it does.
Yeah,
it does. That's what happens to people.
Yeah,
that's even what happens to people in love.
Yes. Yeah.
They, I don't think it's a state that you should remain in, but it tends to, it turns it turns you, not the other person. It turns the other person into God, and it turns you into meat.
Yes. Right. Okay. Okay. So you do have a sense of the divine. It's just again that you're more reluctant than many people to talk about it, or try and sort of.
Well, yeah, because I don't know what people get out of that.
Mm.
I think I don't want to speak for other people, but I think people often enjoy talking about that sort of thing as it relates to the conduct of one's life and to morality and ethical dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
I see those things as very different realms.
How so?
Well, because I think what we're describing, things like death and beauty and so forth, I think they're in some sense amoral.
Yeah, I think that would be fair to say. I guess that the traditional theist take on that would be that something like beauty, maybe even death in some sense, finds a certain unity with ethics in the divine, if that makes sense. And maybe that's a bit vague, but the idea that beauty, truth, and goodness are united in the divine, that they come together. You would maybe resist that a little bit.
Yeah, just out of sheer ignorance, because
like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I just don't. Yeah. I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
it sounds nice.
Yeah,
it sounds appealing.
Fair enough.
It absolutely sounds appealing to me, but how do I action that, or how do I relate myself to that as I am?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Hold on, I'll remove the Yoruba head wrap. All right.
Kay got a little drenched in the rain coming over here, so he had a head wrap. I won't say Yoruba head wrap.
No, it's traditional shamaness.
If there's any Yoruba listeners, I apologize. I don't take responsibility for my guests' comments. Okay, let's move on. We've talked about the divine, and this actually may be a good way to seg into talking about Simone Weil. So I won't talk too much about her because there's really too much to say, but maybe I'll put a link in the video. But my question is this. So on the surface, the philosophers Nietzsche and Weil, they seem very opposed to each other. So for instance, Nietzsche abhorred Christianity as slave morality, whereas Weil actually embraced it precisely as a religion of slaves. That's what she says when she sort of has one of her steps to conversion is seeing, I think it was a religious procession, and saying, there's a religion of slaves and I'm a slave, and this is why it resonates with me. She sees that in a positive way. Self-sacrificial love is central to Weil. While for Nietzsche, he denigrates this and instead elevates will to power. And yet I understand you see a deep harmony between these two philosophers. One similarity that jumps to my mind is that they both emphasize Amor Fati, love of fate. So my question, could you talk about the harmony you see between these two thinkers and how they've influenced you?
Well, maybe harmony is the wrong word, because it makes it sound like they're actually in some kind of agreement in it. But no, I think most people who have read both these authors would see the basic similarities. For me, like you say, so at one point at least, Simone Weil saw Christianity as being fitting for her because she saw herself as a slave, say, or she identified with slaves.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I would push back on that in some ways as well. But like you say, in some sense, regardless of his other proclamations, Nietzsche also wanted to be a slave to fate, if you can put it that way.
Well, yes and no, right? It's very paradoxical when you get to the stage of his thought, because I would see it more as the opposite, maybe. He wants to be master of fate, but to be master of fate is to be a slave to fate, if that makes sense, because we're talking about fate. This is not something that's changeable. And so his idea, as I understand it, is that you affirm what is unavoidable anyway, as though you willed it. And so you make yourself a master of something that you would otherwise just be a passive slave of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's essentially what he says. But, if I could be if I could just ignorance max here for a moment. No, but really, like this, I see this in Weil. Do you not? Do you not think that, I mean, look at how Weil talks about, the way that I see Weil talk about, say, just morality. Okay, so the thing with the procession.
Yeah.
I think it was in Portugal or something.
Yes.
It was one of those ones with the Ku Klux Klan hats.
I don't know that detail, but yes.
Yeah. But the way overall that they conceives of these things doesn't seem that different to me, in that she doesn't. I mean, she sees the playing out of this great kind of drama or tragedy even of life as being, in a sense, kind of determined and mechanistic, and something that you do have to embrace on one level. So in that deep way, I think it's similar to Nietzsche.
And yet it seems psychologically different, but maybe this difference isn't significant, but it seems like,
I think they're different temperaments, but I think I think in terms of what they were trying to achieve, I don't see it as being massively different. I also think it's interesting, just to get biographical again, that even the very form of their affliction was very similar in that, they had this
very physical, and the headaches,
literal pain in their
absolutely
in their skulls,
They're a really interesting case, because I genuinely don't know. I have a lot of sympathy for what you're saying, but I can also see it maybe being the absolute opposite. So, for instance, at least psychologically, and at least in the way they write, Weil wants to be a slave, and she wants to have herself annihilated. At least this is what she's writing. Obviously, she's a complex human being, and part of her doesn't want that, I'm sure. But the way she writes is that she wants to be annihilated, she wants to be a slave, and that's why she submits to fate. That's why she submits to the necessity of the universe. Well, that's not totally fair. She does it also out of love for God, which is not an insignificant factor. So that's what saves her thought from being completely nihilistic, I would say. It's from love, or at least love is a factor. For Nietzsche, though, it's mastery, I think. He knows that the only option is to affirm fate, or to resist fate and resent fate, and so he chooses to affirm it, making himself master. And that's a different psychological impulse.
I see them as more similar than that.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
I mean, I see them as both individuals who struggled with nihilism.
Yes, okay, that's fair. Yeah.
They both had, on some level, a will to destroy themselves.
Yep, that's fair. And Nietzsche talks about his own resentment.
Yeah, in modern terms, they were both traumatized by the facts of their life. And in both cases, that somewhat relates, actually, I think, to being kind of prodigies, and to expectation and familial dynamics and so forth. But I don't know, I guess I would ask this, like, what force allows you to affirm fate?
What force allows you to affirm fate?
Yeah, like, what resource do we have? It can't just be that it's just a decision you make one way or the other. Like, what is it actually that must be unlocked in order to affirm fate?
Well, I think from, and I'm speculating here, but I'd say from the Nietzschean perspective, that is in fact the will to power. There's something we can tap within ourselves. Maybe not everyone can do this. Maybe this is precisely what it means to be the Übermensch, which is not to be an ordinary person. But maybe there's something that we can harness in ourselves that gives us that extra force. For Weil, I think it's very different for her, because she's not talking about self-assertion. She's talking about letting go and giving up, or sacrificing for God. So I don't know what the answer is. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, this is a total bastardization of everybody, but so
And the more orthodox Christian answer, of course, would be that God helps you to do it. God makes you do it. The Holy Spirit does it. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, for Nietzsche, he does identify power in the powerful individual with some aspects of what you could say traditional virtue, even maybe Christian virtue, with, self-mastery, which implies at least in one aspect self-restraint.
Yes. Yes. So there's a positive side to Christian virtue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I guess he would say something like, like Christianity just muddles the reality of what this is. You're looking at powerful individuals and kind of claiming them and identifying them with the masses, who don't actually tend to exhibit those virtues, and just kind of asserting that they do or they will.
Because a saint essentially has to be a powerful individual.
A saint is an exceptional person.
Yes.
And it's not to do with where they come from and good breeding or anything like that, but they're clearly not. They're almost by definition not like the people around them. And Weil was like that as well, and she made multiple attempts to kind of be involved with the poor, the proletariat or the peasants, or with various kind of leftist strains, but she was always an outsider.
Yes, there's that story where she was trying to teach like some peasant girl the Upanishads or something like that.
It's actually
girl
cringe.
was not interested.
It's actually you actually feel embarrassed for her because she was so privileged that she didn't understand what normal people are like. People that are much, at least to me, I identify much more with the working class people that she was kind of punishing with the Upanishads or with Plato or whatever it was. Okay, so
the original question was, what is it in us that allows us to make that step into Amor Fati, essentially?
Well, look, I guess what I'm saying is I can see Weil seems to be attempting something quite similar in a way. So Nietzsche identifies to some degree power or the powerful, the kind of excellent, powerful individual with a kind of self-mastery, right? I think there is a sense of the concept of self-mastery in Weil because Weil kind of elevates this concept of attention over action.
Yes. And
action is the default. Action is kind of impulsiveness. It's actually what the weak person does. It's what the reactive person does, to use more kind of Nietzschean terms, right? It takes a lot of strength. It takes a lot of self-mastery to kind of apprehend the world without needing to react. Yeah. I think when you start looking at it that way, it gets very close to some of the things that Nietzsche describes. The person that doesn't need, he kind of suggests, in an ironic way, like, well, it's not even ironic. I mean, he thinks this is true, and I actually think this is true as well. Like, the person who is in a position of power, the person who is kind of exceptional with relation to his surroundings, doesn't need cruelty, doesn't need resentment, and that kind of exists in the Christian conception as well. Yeah. Well, actually, no. Let me rephrase. Not in the Christian conception, but you see him use that with reference to like Jesus. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That he may have been this kind of individual who just stood above his society, was beyond the need for retaliation. Yes. And that he was actually exhorting a kind of inward turn. Yes. Weil, I think, is very similar in that she's saying, okay, you will think it, and I think her thought did develop. I think she stopped being an activist at some point, even if she still was doing things. But I think the earlier thought you have to kind of cut off, and even like gravity and grace, I think you have to kind of bracket it somewhat. I don't think it fully encompasses where she ended up. I think ultimately, at least what I take away from it, is this concept of attention, which seems radically different from activism and from action and so forth.
Yeah.
I think it's very Nietzschean in that it kind of says, like, you have to have this inherent resoluteness to not react. And then, in her terms perhaps, God will act on you.
And you could say that's true
Or
power.
through you.
Okay, yeah. But as you also emphasize, that's true power. Power is not reacting forcefully necessarily. That's maybe a small form of power, but the more profound form of power is being able to not react.
Yeah, and I think that's in Nietzsche. I
I
know that
agree.
people would say maybe explicitly it looks like he's celebrating, but no, I mean, come on, like, we don't think that Nietzsche was just celebrating.
And I do see a convergence there, right? So attention, apprehending the world as it is, requires an extreme degree of strength. And
there's something classical about
resolution.
it. There's something, dare I say, pre-Christian, pagan about it. This idea of a kind of indifference. I mean, look, I'm just I'm a civilian, but if I read Weil on these things, her concept of vice or of sin, of immorality, her concept of justice even, to me seems, I don't think she was some kind of Orthodox Catholic.
No.
I think that her concept of these things is actually close to Nietzsche. People, everything else being the same, people are, I don't know what I think she has her own phrasing, but people are like leaves on the wind. People, no matter what they do, no matter how horrifying, no matter how much it makes us as flesh and blood human beings cry out for justice, it's really just a mechanical, physical expression of God or of mathematical realities, and it doesn't. It's not the individual's job to become, to militate against it.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because
I don't know if I expressed that.
For Weil, vice and evil are mechanical, but they're not distinguished too much from just the way the universe operates. Really.
Absolutely, I think she would be, in a sense, comfortable with the initial quote that you started with.
To a degree, I think that, I mean, she explicitly emphasizes justice. So she does.
She would add something.
She does talk about justice, and she even would talk about it, maybe not in precisely the same words, but I think she has an idea of, and she's very Platonist, I think she has an idea of justice in itself. And yet what's interesting about Weil, and this is what I talk about a little bit in my article, in my video, is that she keeps the two realms separate. So yes, there is a justice in itself, in a sense. This is my reading of her. But it's not going to come and transform the actual world. There is no sense, or very little sense, of resurrection and of final judgment and of, the paradise that will come to earth. The mechanical nature of the world.
I shouldn't have introduced that word mechanical, but it's just, I'm trying to put across.
Well, she uses it, doesn't she?
I think maybe.
Well, she talks about necessity.
It's not really what I mean, but I'm talking about necessity. I'm talking about. I'm trying to emphasize the sheer lack of human emotion and sentiment.
And of course, that necessity that governs the world, which includes the violence of nature, and which for Weil is not eradicable from nature, is itself a kind of way to connect to God, a way to a mask of God. This is probably my phrase rather than hers, but it's a way to come into contact with God. If you see if you see the universe, which is constituted by necessity, as being God's loving gift for you to be, then you can kind of see all that violence as being something that points to God and brings you into relationship with him. Of course, the corollary for that, for Weil, is that demands a reciprocal self-sacrifice of yourself. God limits himself and sacrifices himself and subjects himself to limitation, and also subjects the universe to limitation for your sake. She wants you to reciprocate that and abolish yourself. And this is where all this talk about affliction and annihilation of the self and so forth comes in, which is like we've talked about. It's actually a very it's very mystical, and it's very saintly, you could say, and it's something that I would say alienates a lot of people, normal people, and rightly so, because this is something that is only really even feasible or remotely attractive to people with incredible power and intelligence, like Weil, I think, although she would have denied that of herself. Certainly it's something that I don't want to do in any actual felt way. I think something like that is true of Nietzsche as well, although perhaps less so, because you can interpret him as someone who just gives you carte blanche to be, to be domineering and to be arrogant and but ultimately I think for the vast majority of people his philosophy is on the surface distasteful and even just horrifying. Yes. But that's not how I read it. I mean, I see it as being light, and he talks about lightness a lot. Flying,
he talks about
dancing
a lot, and it's not like it's even a metaphor. He's literally talking about music and dancing and walking in the woods. Yes. I see an affinity there with Weil. Yes. In that it says, like, the world is the way it is. Like, yes. It's Nietzsche has different terms, and he had socio-historical reasons for emphasizing what he did. But I mean, in conventional terms, isn't there some kind of connection between affirming life or affirming creation and like affirming God or divinity?
Yeah, and that would certainly.
And in that sense, Nietzsche is a very, a very good kind of. Except he would leave that last part unsaid. Weil would say it explicitly, right? Yeah, I mean, I would leave it unsaid as well. Not because I am like Nietzsche, but just because I can't say it. I'm not in any position to talk about God. And I agree. Although maybe I'm speaking just for myself, but I certainly have a urge to, or a desire to, right? But I get what you're saying. If you haven't had that experience, it sounds a bit hypocritical to try and start talking about. I mean, God. I've had experiences, but I don't think. I don't know. Maybe it's different for different people. For me, the experience of divinity. Perhaps if I was like a writer and that was my entire vocation, I would be able to write about it, say. Yeah. Or if I was a speaker, I don't know. But for me, that sense of proximity to something greater, it silences me more than anything. I think the other issue is maybe that we aren't kind of moored to a definite religious tradition, and so most people can talk quite easily. Yeah, but then again, I think, I mean, Weil and Nietzsche both had. I don't think it's a problem for them. I think that's what makes them so rich in a way. But they're also extremely powerful individuals who had certain experiences. Yeah. So that's their benefit. Yeah. And they have the intelligence, and they have the inheritance. Well, I mean, they could essentially draw on the entire tradition. And they could draw on exactly. I mean, we can reference, but we can't necessarily embody. It takes, just on Nietzsche, as you were talking, I was thinking about, his very early work, The Birth of Tragedy, where he still has that Schopenhauerian spin. That might be where you actually do see God or something like God come into the equation, because,
that's kind of the Dionysian. The Dionysian is the breakthrough to the substrate, like we were talking about before, and that is seeing reality as it is. He kind of jettisons, at least talking about that kind of monistic will later, but there's enough similarity in his early thought and his later thought that you could reintroduce it potentially if you were so inclined. You could reintroduce that. Do you know what I'm getting at? Like in terms of like, yes, but there is this substrate. There is this Dionysian.
Yeah, I suppose that's that's how I tend to read it. I think the connotations that come through do so because he was also in a kind of political context, and he was also in a kind of battle against people who would try and foreclose that type of thought.
Yeah.
That was, you know...
Do you mean in his later work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going to look polemically...
Yes.
Anti-theistic, say.
Yes. And anti-metaphysical as well.
But I and I'm not saying that it secretly is theistic. Like, I totally agree. I think, like I've kind of been saying, I think there are things which are difficult to speak about, and I don't know if it's correct to speak about them. I don't know if that gets us closer to anything of value.
Yeah.
I see that kind of conflict and that kind of ambiguity in Weil as well.
Yeah. Because, she has that famous thing where she says, actually, I think that unless you've had an experience of God, you should be an atheist. Like, you should not just be talking about God as though God were real if you have had no experience. Just be an atheist. Which is kind of true to her experience, because that's what she was.
Yeah. But also her kind of extremely piercing and sophisticated way of speaking about divinity or transcendence or whatever you want to call it. Like, I don't know, it in a way it begs the question, like these people who she throughout her life at different junctions reached out to, whether it be, the peasants, the proletariat, or just the French masses as a whole, or the soldiers. Yeah. Like, I don't know, what do they mean then? Because they don't have the same idea of God or anything. So what do their lives mean? To
her, you mean? What do they mean?
Well, to anybody. What does their perspective mean?
In themselves,
In themselves, yeah. I identify with those people.
Well, are they part of the mechanics of the universe? Like, that's what we were suggesting before.
Well,
that would seem to strip them of value.
Well, I'm asking this a little bit facetiously as a kind of it's a provocation, but, or just the masses of people, all the people that have gone before, what does that mean then? Because they don't have this relation to these things.
I think she believes in ordinary sanctity, and so if I was to try and defend her, I would say something like she does believe that affliction touches a lot of people, and it's actually more likely to touch the poor. But maybe
but is that what it comes down to?
Well, that seems to be one of the most important things is how you respond to affliction. And if the poor in question are, say, Christian, or influenced by those ideals, we could say Cathars as well, or something like that, right? She doesn't want to draw...
Okay, but what about the billions of pagans?
Well, she also likes paganism too, They might be orphically inclined or something like that. I don't know, but... I see your point, and it's also begs the question of, is this actually how they respond to affliction? I don't know. This is all we don't really have ready access to peasants nowadays. Like, everyone is kind of fundamentally different in a way.
In a way, we have more access because we kind of have this voyeuristic ability to just pry into anybody's life anywhere. But at the same time, we're destroying that subjectivity.
And everyone is contaminated by something that's fundamentally alien to that life. But I want to. I have a couple of other topics to cover. So I want to move away from Weil. I want to move actually towards Max Scheler. So this is a thinker I've done a video on recently on his hierarchy of values. It's a thinker I really like and has really influenced me. So basically, Scheler's a phenomenologist, so he's looking at experience and trying to really draw out what is available in experience without extrapolating too much beyond that. So not really speculative, but more when he talks about values, for instance, that's his focus. So when we're thinking about values, when we're experiencing values, what is in there implicitly or explicitly? So he develops this hierarchy, and I'll link to that video, but basically the values of the useful and agreeable are at the bottom of the hierarchy. Then we move up to the vital and the noble, and then up to the spiritual values, which can also be understood as intellectual values. They include moral goodness, beauty, and truth. And then finally at the top of the hierarchy, the most important values, the highest values, are the values of the holy. And so, I mean, to me, this seems pretty accurate in the sense of accurate to my experience. Not that I've had too much experience of, say, the higher values like the holy, but it's certainly if we're comparing like utility and pleasure to something like power and health, or if we're comparing any of those that I just mentioned to, say, goodness, beauty, and truth, the scheme he outlined seems accurate. But beauty, goodness, and truth clearly seem higher, more important than utility, pleasure, power, health. And so I think this speaks against a view, let's say a Nietzschean or a vitalist view, that tries to fully affirm only the immanent processes of life. Now, that's not your view, as we've talked about, but I feel like you're maybe more closely aligned to that perspective than I am. So this is why I'm asking about this. How do you see this? Would you agree with this kind of hierarchy? And if so, well, regardless of what you think about that, do you see the higher values as reducible to vital values? Do you see them as being immanent in their own right? Or how do you see that?
Well, I mean, what exactly is the argument here? Just that there's a hierarchy of values?
This would be the argument if I was to relate it to that tension between transcendent and immanent. It would be that, if we're thinking about something like pleasure, power, as an experience of power, we're talking about something very immanent. If we're talking about things like beauty, goodness, truth, and certainly the holy, we're talking about something that in experience is transcendent, if you know what I mean. Like, it is something that is beyond us, something that we're intentionally related to in a way that is something that cannot be, like we alluded to before, cannot be encompassed by us, cannot be turned to our use, and it doesn't exist just within us, if that makes sense. That's how I would see it. And so this hierarchy, to me, speaks to, it kind of fits with this immanent, transcendent tension or duality. But do you see it in the same way, or does it just not sort of map onto that, like, for you?
No, I think there could be a lot of truth in that, but I have a feeling that smuggles in a kind of argument about a radically different phenomenology where values are perceived immanently. Is that not the case?
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, where values precede other forms of perception, say.
That actually seems to be, if my understanding is correct, that actually seems to be Scheler's view.
Yeah.
In the sense that values are right at the forefront of perception, I guess you could call it. Like we don't first perceive the phenomena and then perceive the value. We actually perceive the value almost before the actual phenomena.
Yeah, that's my understanding of his.
But you're saying that doesn't seem accurate to you.
Well, it seems like a huge. It seems like a lot to take on. I don't know if I want to take. I don't know if I want to take like a concrete position on that. But the way that you paraphrased it just now, I'm somewhat sympathetic to. I think it is kind of like a skill issue, if you can put it that way, in that, I think it does relate back to and in some sense Nietzsche, in that there are certain things that there are different ways that we should apprehend different things. Like there are, it's kind of like what I had said earlier. There are things that we cannot consume and
Yes.
entirely process.
Yes.
And knowing the difference between those categories is kind of important for navigating life.
And one really good and perhaps maybe not too controversial example would be truth, maybe, right? But can we consume truth? Like, can we actually encompass and consume truth? It seems to be always outside of our reach in some sense. Would you agree with that or no? I'm trying to think of because I could talk about morality, but that might be more contentious. But
no, I think it may be the case that, and I kind of think that's what Weil is getting at with her thought, this idea of, superficially it looks like a kind of passivity, but actually it's the most kind of engaged thing you can do. Because there are certain realities in the face of which you cannot coherently act, or your action is irrelevant. There are also other things where to act is a form of weakness.
In the sense that we talked about before, of like reaction to something, or in a different
yeah, sense? well, yeah, and that I guess something becomes a reaction. It's possible that that's a better way of conceiving of maybe vice and sin and so forth. Like, there are things that, and I think this fits into this can almost fit into an entirely like aesthetic view of life, if you want to put it that way, because it's not correct that the aesthetic view of life always has to tip over into pure sensuality, because pure sensuality actually destroys aesthetic value in a lot of cases. Yeah. This is me like totally reframing this question, but I can see it in those terms. Like, there are cases where consumption, where we're eating the thing or consummating the thing, destroys the thing.
And this is very much Weil as well, isn't it? Like, she talks about actually the tension between looking and eating. Yeah. And maybe you could also say that,
and I know that's not exactly what Scheler's saying, but I think that's my way of relating to that. I can totally understand that there are cases where you must consume, where you must where it's entirely the right decision to destroy something in order to increase your own strength. And there seem to be cases where it's simply not the correct course of action.
So this is interesting. So I actually want to dive into that, because that kind of speaks right to the heart of this problem of the violence of life and justice. So how do you know when it is a time where you can destroy and consume and when you must not?
I mean, I think we kind of have a, and maybe this would be quite, maybe this would fit quite nicely with Scheler, but I think we do have a certain inherent instinctual apprehension of these things.
So it's something that intuition can give us.
Perhaps it's to do with strength. Perhaps we encounter objects in the world. Some of them we can apprehend as being, in a sense, kind of inferior or as being subordinate to our needs, and others we apprehend as being something else, something more.
Right, you can consume animals, but you can't consume God. Or
even humans.
Catholicism to some muddles that
archaic morality.
Yes, right. Yeah, right. Okay. I mean, interesting.
I don't know. This is just me trying to approach it through my own temperament. But
I asked this question about Scheler in a way to sort of say, does this does this strengthen the case for a tension between, or for the reality of the duality of immanence and transcendence? But there's also another aspect to Scheler, which I think is relevant to this problem, which is that there is a hierarchy which places vital values below spiritual values. And so I feel like that's really promising in a sense, because it actually gives, it doesn't deny the one or the other, but it does place them into a hierarchical relationship. And I think that's, so what we're ruling out, and so when I'm talking about vital values as well, just for clarity, we're talking something more or less like the Nietzschean will to power, and we're talking about what comes down to in practice dominance and consumption and destroying other beings for your own sake. But we're also talking about other interesting phenomena as well, like generosity, like the generosity of a king or the generosity of a noble person.
But it can be the generosity of anybody, really.
Yes, potentially, although I think Nietzsche and Scheler want to draw a line between generosity that's manifest from noble power and generosity which is kind of the sick, ascetic, instinctive resentment.
But that's just not generosity.
Yeah. But anyway, in terms of vital values, this is, that feeling of vitality and that feeling of wanting to advance and assert your will and improve yourself and so forth. And what that means is to do that for the sake of other people. So it's also where health comes into this. If you're healthy, and we can relate this all to like physical phenomena, because obviously to be healthy you need to consume, you need to destroy other beings. And so what's interesting about Scheler is that has a place on the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. He's not saying don't do this. This is not a kind of Tolstoyan,
of course,
nihilistic spiritual denial of our impulses. Even sexuality largely could be placed on that level. I mean, partly it's pleasure, but partly it's also something vital, right? It's infused with a vital impulse. If it was just pleasure, it would be a different phenomenon entirely. It's almost mostly that, isn't it? And
I think people are just confused about these things.
Yes, yeah.
It's not really about pleasure.
It's a complex thing. I think it's also about, like we talked about the other day, social connection, and it's almost
the pleasure
a
is secondary.
Thing. Yeah,
the pleasure is just because there's the need to discharge energy.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think
and this applies to many realms.
I think that often, at least, it's primarily vital. It's a vital impulse, and then I think it's complex. Like again, you could bring the spiritual level in the sense of you are, encountering someone else in a very deep way, or
it causes that
feeling the presence of another being, and then of course you've got the physical pleasure. So it's a complex phenomenon. My point being then that you have this and it's affirmed, but it's in a certain relationship. So it actually agrees with Nietzsche in the sense that he also would place vital values over hedonic values, because to be a mere hedonist is not actually, like you alluded to before, it's not actually what Nietzsche wants. No. Because there's no self-mastery in that. You're just a slave to pleasure. And yet it also... Scheler is someone who, for me at least, is trying to, at least at this stage of his philosophy, trying to unite the Christian and the Nietzschean worldviews, which is why I find him so fascinating. But he admits the Christian values, and he places them above the Nietzschean, but he doesn't abolish the Nietzschean. And I think that's what potentially frees him from ressentiment, which is, he's not again like Tolstoy going around saying, actually no, I'm saying no to sexuality for everyone, thank you. I'm saying no to violence.
Everyone except me.
Well, he was consistent as far as I know.
Any claims.
He was consistent. I actually heard a story. A professor once told this story about a follower of him came to Tolstoy in his his estate or whatever, where he went out and worked with the peasants because his wife still held the estate, and he So he had this weird position. But anyway, obviously he'd get a lot of visitors and followers and admirers. And this young admirer came to him and was sort of like, I castrated myself because I'm sure, like, and he was, I think he was a bit awkward about it, like that. Obviously this follower had gone further than he himself had, but I can't recall if he.
I would be upset by that.
Yeah, I would think so.
Like, please stop.
In any case, this is not what Scheler is advocating.
No.
So it's interesting though, because it does give. I would say this hierarchy is basically right. I've seen online, there's that kind of Nietzschean subculture. There's that kind of subculture around bodybuilding and Nietzsche and so forth. And I think there's a lot of positive value in that. But I think that really they take Nietzsche to. I certainly don't see the kind of sophistication into sort of reading between the lines in Nietzsche. Power seems to really be the ultimate principle.
Well, but what do you think they're trying to do, though? I mean, like, do you think they would be better served by if they were to orient themselves to something else? Should they remain a subculture? I mean, because look, you have to, like, okay, there's this Nietzschean subculture, call it what you will, very ironic.
Yeah.
But are we juxtaposing them against the Christian influencer subculture? Is that more virtuous? I say no.
Yeah. No, fair enough.
I say I prefer the Nietzscheans because to me they're much funnier and they're much more fun to be around.
I guess my question would be: do they stop at a lower level of value than they should? So what I mean by that is, yes, I agree with you, especially if the Christian camp are driven by resentment or just whatever happens to be fashionable in terms of ethics or just weakness. Sure, I agree with you, but can power be the ultimate motivator, or is power just ultimately in its own way a means to something that's more deeply valuable? So what I mean by that is, and this is consistent with, like, as far as I can see, with chivalry and with medieval notions of this, right, is that yes, you have power, yes, you have that vital stuff, but you use it for kind of transcendent values. You use it for the pursuit of goodness, beauty, and truth. So that is the knight. The knight has genuine power, and he actually kills people, but what does he do it for, right? I mean,
well, but in reality,
in reality, it's more complex. But he does it for.
Well, look, I guess I just have and maybe this isn't correct on some level. I mean, I don't care, but I guess the way I read Nietzsche, it's like we discussed earlier. I read him and they as being closer.
Yeah.
And I read that as being closer to maybe the very earliest ideas of Christianity, say. Or, I don't even want to say that, actually. But I read it...
Can we say Jesus?
I was going to say closer to the parables as well.
Yeah. Because potentially the breakers with Paul.
Well,
we won't go into that, but we could say if you could say
Paul's
Jesus.
cancelled. So
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's not prescriptive. It's so it requires power. In a sense, it is about power, but it's realist. What can you do with that power? You, like we discussed earlier, in a sense, you're compelled to affirm fate. It's like, well, what does that mean? I mean, is that so different from submission?
Let's talk about that for a second. That whole idea of affirming fate, because I think this is another thing that enters into the problem.
I mean, even Jesus submits. That's an interesting.
Yeah, I think
it's not like
that is really interesting.
It's not like he goes around trumpeting the fact that he's God.
He does that a little bit in the.
He does that a little bit, but I don't blame him. But, But his ultimate act is essentially an act of submission.
Absolutely, and it's submission to God, and it's a submission to violence. And if you take a kind of Girardian view, it's submission to the kind of mechanical processes of scapegoat mechanism or whatever, right? Like it's a submission to the kind of blind forces of society.
Well, I mean, he might say it's a subversion of that.
Because
it tears it apart.
But that's the thing. That's the interesting thing, right? And this is where I want to go with this, is that there's a Christian view of submission to fate, and there's a Nietzschean view and maybe a Weian view of submission to fate, and they don't seem to be exactly the same. So, for instance, what I mean is that Christians always have the notion of resurrection, and what resurrection means is a transformation of the very conditions of material reality. And that is what I think makes submission in the Christian context different from submission where the material world is always going to be the same. You see what I mean? So, for instance, the fact that Jesus submits to the material conditions of death and the social conditions that lead to his death, in a sense, right? Like he could have escaped his death, leads to the resurrection, which is actually the transformation of the social conditions, which we've seen throughout the couple of millennia since, and at least for Christians, the material conditions, because he comes back in a resurrected body.
Well, I mean, maybe you can kind of educate me on this, but did they explicitly believe in the eschaton and the transformation of the world and the resurrection of the dead and the return of the Messiah?
She certainly didn't emphasize it.
Yeah, I don't see that in her thought. I know that, mystically speaking, which I totally give full credence to, she had an experience with this being, Jesus.
Yes.
But beyond that...
No, you're right.
I don't see a big difference.
She resisted emphasizing the afterlife, the resurrection of Jesus. But I think it's maybe I haven't read too much into it, but as far as I can tell, it's still a somewhat open question what she exactly believed or not. I think I've read somewhere that she did ultimately believe in the resurrection. She just thought that it was very dangerous to emphasize it because it was a form of consolation to people, and we don't want people to be consoled. We want them to submit to affliction. Or at least, she I'm being uncharitable because she wouldn't phrase it like that. She would phrase it in the first person. I am supposed to be submitting to affliction. So, it's hard to detach that from a kind of sadistic streak that some people can detect in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's there. But I think there's a certain greatness as well.
But why did you bring up Vey? Because I don't actually identify her with the Christian position. I actually think she's a distinct position. So
yeah, no, I think she's a distinct position as well.
I think she's a distinct position for that very reason you brought up, because she doesn't emphasize resurrection and transformation of material reality. In fact, she resists it, and I would say in terms of eschaton, she's more likely to say that's not even a thing.
All right, sure, you caught me. No, I guess I brought her up because you seem to think that she has a way of bringing in a kind of transcendence and referring specifically to Christian concepts.
Yes.
Yet, I think we agree that she doesn't affirm, or at least doesn't explicitly affirm, any of this transformation of the world.
Exactly. But that's exactly my point. So she does have a clear, at least in my mind, a clear distinction between immanence and transcendence, between the transcendent God and the immanent world, which is at least not clear in Nietzsche, right? Like he does not. Later Nietzsche does not emphasize that at all.
He doesn't, but I mean, it really.
But maybe we can read between the lines. I'll grant you that.
It's not even that, because I have no objective here. I have no desire to prove that he was referring to the transcendent, but. Isn't it similar what he was describing when he talks about eternal recurrence and affirmation of fate, Amor Fati?
I think it's similar to Vey, yes, but is it similar to Christianity? I think it's much less so, yeah.
Yeah, okay, but I think Christianity has aspects which neither of us can account for, which neither of us are actually trying to defend.
Well,
ultimately.
I'm open to them, but they're very, very difficult. So, for instance, like the notion of resurrection and the notion of the transformation of reality, and even the notion that the world was created perfect and then there was a full. I mean, it's hard to make sense of these because what would it mean for physical reality to exist without predation and you know what I mean? Like in the video
Yep.
and in the article, I talk about the lion laying down with the lamb, right?
Yeah, well, that's your problem, isn't it?
But
I mean,
we're not just talking about a matter of like, because we could do this now in a sense, maybe not right now, but we could, let's say, genetically tamper with lions such that they do indeed lie down with lambs rather than predate on them. But here's the problem: a lion is precisely what it is because of its predation. It's evolved that way to look like it looks, to, like the essence of a lion is in fact tied up with the fundamental violence of existence.
yeah, I mean, the more
and
sensitive...
and humans too, right? Humans as well.
Us sensitive young men, even animals in zoos are sometimes upsetting.
Yeah.
Because we can see their limitation.
Yeah.
Let alone going into the last, few vestiges of nature and stripping it all away. I don't want that. So what to make of that? But I don't want that for humans either. So what does that mean? Am I opposed to justice?
Well, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that you don't want that for humans, so we have to continue to be violent? Like, is that what you're saying?
Well, look, I don't care. I don't care if we have to be violent or not. Like, do I have the impulse to extirpate any kind of passion that tips over into physical violence from the human race? Well, absolutely not.
Oh, good, because that's also how I feel about it. I think a lot of people don't feel like that, though, which is interesting. But
I don't know. I don't believe that. I know that was one of your kind of questions or points of contention. I don't buy that. I don't know if anyone believes that.
I think I know that people
claim that.
I know
what
that
people claim is utterly irrelevant.
I would agree. I would agree with that because, right, that at the end of the day, they are in fact human, and actually they have the same impulses.
Well, just look at them. Look at what they enjoy.
Yes.
Look at at their capacity for sadistic Schadenfreude and just pleasure in destroying their enemies.
And that's
people who are most identified with justice
have
this is like such a
have the most sick revenge.
Well, it's such an obvious point.
Yeah.
Look, I'll go further than that.
Yeah.
People who are victims, who are genuine, bona fide, everyone would agree they're a victim. Those people often enjoy, revenge more than anyone else.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, that just seems intuitively,
of course,
true. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But in the Christian conception, they should be somehow elevated by their victimhood. Why do we claim that? I don't.
Well, I guess I've
never understood that.
Well, they would say that there's different ways to experience affliction, or to respond.
Well, there certainly are.
And one will annihilate your ego, and the other, in a good way. Let's say annihilate your ego in a good way, and the other will corrupt you, basically. And that seems true. I mean, that seems consistent with, like, for instance, Viktor Frankl's experience of the concentration camps. People became either saints or they just, like, stole the last bread from their neighbors, kind of thing.
Sonderkommandos.
Yeah, exactly. Or they actively collaborated.
Well, I mean, most people in a sense did. I don't blame them.
No, we're not casting moral judgments.
No, but I'm just saying, like, it's almost a natural function of being human.
Absolutely.
If someone applies enough force to you, you do what you're told. You don't like it. Yeah.
So I want to just sort of take a step back and kind of revisit this question of Christianity versus these other views that maybe Maybe just affirm immanence, but maybe also admit transcendence, but keep it separate, like they, for instance, right? The difference being that Christianity does say the immanent world as it is, with all its violence, can be transformed into something that is actually free from violence and is actually perfectly just and is actually essentially blissful, holy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be like the most significant Christian tenet, which obviously the flip side of that is that how do you achieve this? You achieve this through self-sacrificial love, and that's where they can kind of come in and talk about that. But the other side is that there is this hope about the transformation of reality. And I don't know, to be honest, how many Christians literally believe this nowadays, but there is the idea of the general resurrection. Like, your physical body will be revived and will live in paradise. And that is the ultimate resolution of this problem of justice versus the violence of life. So I don't know if you have anything more to kind of say about that. I assume you really don't take that too seriously. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, but I mean,
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think that so like I've hinted at before, it's actually hard for me to conceptually understand what that would actually be. For instance, like,
Yeah, it doesn't seem very appealing, does it?
well, appealing. Let's talk about like.
It doesn't to me.
Let me take it step by step, because I think, yes, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right about appealing. I think it's hard to imagine for the reasons I've talked about, right? Like we as organisms are constituted by evolutionary pressures which involve violence, dominance, protection from predators, etc., etc. Our brains even have evolved because we need to control our environments through technology.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is actually what makes us up. And this seems almost unfair or too crass, but, like, we literally eat things and, digest them and expel them. The whole system of a human being is enmeshed entirely in a world that is constituted by violence. That's how I would see it if I wanted to sort of steelman that imminent position. Now, on the other side,
would you rather that weren't the case?
Okay, so you're talking about the appeal. So I'll get there in a second.
I'm just,
okay.
Okay. Go on.
So in terms of believability, though, right? Do I think it's possible that Jesus died and then literally came back to life again in a physical body that was also somehow spiritual or could do things that regular bodies can't? I mean, I do think it's possible, because I don't have a hard physicalist worldview. I don't insist that sort of miracles can never happen, magic isn't possible, things like that.
I would much rather concede that than the perfection of creation.
Yeah, because actually you can nest that in the immanent worldview without talking about perfection of all creation. You can say, yes, okay, a body came back to life. That makes sense. You could even say a body, it's harder to imagine, but you could say, yes, that body that came back to life walked through a wall or whatever, Who knows what's possible? Do I think that's possible? Yes. Do I think that the saints probably manifested, psychic powers, were able to affect matter in ways
Just to be clear, every great religion has saints, right?
Every great religion has saints, and
they all are capable of these sorts of things.
Exactly, like in of course,
at least in
Hindu saints manifest the cities, and obviously the intention is not to be corrupted by them and to sort of just use your magic power. But it's so, which is interesting, because the emphasis is generally, yes, there are these powers, but do not focus on them at all. Far from sort of being like, you can think of like a skeptic wanting to sort of argue with those types and sort of being like, but you're proposing these powers and you're arguing for these powers, and you can imagine this sort of Hindu sage being like, no, I actually think it would be better if you don't think about them. And it's almost like they take them for granted, that they just appear, which to me gives a little more credence to it. But again, there's a difference between that and the total perfection of immanent of reality as we know it. Now, appeal. appeal. I think what you're hinting at least this is what comes up for me, is that a universe in which there was no conflict, no tension, no distress, and no desire for increase, for power, for competition, for dominance, no lust, no fear, would not ultimately be an enjoyable one. Is that fair to say? That does feel true to me to some extent.
Something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. Because that seems to be what human beings actually thrive on most of the time.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's not that I enjoy hurting people.
But don't you on some level? I certainly do.
I don't think I do. Oh, well, maybe I do.
Surely everyone does. I mean, maybe I'm just outing myself as a terrible sadist.
Gotcha.
Don't you? I mean,
end it now.
Isn't that why we do these things? Especially,
no.
Well, let's take an example like vengeance. That certainly feels good, right?
It does superficially.
It does superficially. There's an element in there, and I think for most people,
no, I think forgiveness feels a lot better if you can do it genuinely.
I think you're right, and I think that's why it's genuinely higher.
It's not easy.
No, it's incredibly
we have
difficult.
Limited capability to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, no, and I think it's a higher thing to aspire to.
Yes,
I think love is better than hatred.
No, absolutely. So this is more in line with that worldview. But
I mean, like, okay, what does that imply? Do I not still want to eat? Do I not still want to have sex?
Yes, you still have those lower levels of value.
Well, are they lower? I mean, they don't actually.
But you have implied it. You said love is better than hate, and
is sex hatred?
Forgiveness
is eating hatred?
Well, is inflicting violence on others hatred?
No, not necessarily.
So, okay.
It can be. I mean, and I think it is for the person who is barely able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, let's say.
I think for the person who can just barely aspire to that, there's a large aspect of it is just the mere exercise of that power. I mean, on another being.
I guess we need to be more. Maybe we're going too far afield, because I guess we need to bring it back to like the violence of nature. Is slaughtering an animal to eat it to sustain yourself, and even more than sustain yourself, let's say to feel healthy and vital? Is it hatred? No, of course not. You don't hate the animal,
right?
Yeah,
yeah. But if the animal is like better than you,
right?
If you feel that it's better than you,
yes,
and you kill it anyway because it's too beautiful, you don't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, then
well, that's
then
resentment.
You have a problem.
That's resentment. That's
but I think that's the difference. You know.
So in that sense, I would agree with you. I think that's a terrible, terrible emotion. Would be better off without that resentful hatred.
I mean, if you are having sex with someone and it's even to some degree motivated by dominating them and feeling better than them, then I mean, I think you've gone astray.
But can you fully extirpate that from sexuality? I mean, it seems to me that that a certain amount of that is always entwined with sexuality on both sides.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, I mean, but you know, I'm referencing the Nietzschean line on this that at a certain point you're simply not thinking about these things.
Yeah, fair enough.
And, you know,
No, that's a good way of thinking about it.
You know, and I was brought up around ritual slaughter of animals.
Right, yeah.
And I saw that plenty of times. We definitely did, you know, we were thankful.
Yes.
And we loved the animal.
Yes.
And we were thankful for what it provided.
Yes.
And there was no hatred there.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right, and I think also because you're talking about intention. Like, where is your intention at?
Yep.
It's like, yes, you have to eat, and therefore, yes, you have to kill. But what's your intention? Is it resentful hatred, or is it almost gratitude? Really?
Yeah, and I think so. Like, I'm trying to penetrate into this question that you're asking about Christianity. Is it the radical ultimate alternative to all of this?
Well, you actually asked more or less effectively, you asked, is it appealing, this notion of final paradise, of everything made perfect? So what do you think? Is it appealing?
No.
No, and why not?
Because I feel like it's a I feel like it's a form of mythology. It's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of appealing.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I'm a human being.
Of course, yeah.
I'm not even, I'm not a special human being.
Mm.
I have the same impulses as probably the average person.
Yeah.
In a certain mood, that's absolutely what I want.
Mm.
But is that the core of Christianity? I don't know. I mean, Christianity seems much more austere and indifferent to human suffering, in a sense, than that. To me, like there's the thing, putting the demons into the pigs and then having them, the spirits, and then having them run over the cliff.
Yeah.
I mean, what does that mean?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously people would debate that. I've always read that parable. It's not a parable. It's like an action, I guess. But
I mean, there's a few like that. There's the fig tree, the date tree?
So yeah, let's say cursing the fig tree and the demons being driven into the pigs. I mean, I can't remember how many pigs or if they state the number, but there's a lot of pigs. One human life is more valuable than all these animals. That could be one interpretation of it.
Mm-hmm.
Which isn't to say the animals have no value, but is to say that, like a human soul is of that much value. But
I mean, it doesn't exactly like...
With the cursing of the fig tree too, maybe you could read that as saying that, because obviously that actually is part of a parable, because they come back the next day and it's dead, and then Jesus says basically this is like this people basically, God came and expected fruit, but the fruit wasn't there, and therefore but so that you could draw the conclusion that for a plant, maybe I'm thinking too much into this, right? But for a plant, being used as a parable for human spiritual edification is actually sufficient to justify its death. Mm-hmm. Maybe. I mean, these are more...
Yeah, but where do you draw the line then?
These are more disturbing.
So it's okay for an animal, it's okay for a plant.
Mm.
I mean, if we look at the Old Testament, it seems to be okay for entire ethnos.
Race, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is part of the Judeo-Christian worldview that is a bit harder to stomach in the modern era. Maybe.
Was it good?
Well, this is the very question we're debating, right? Because we're talking about levels of value, and we're talking about how violence relates to everything else. And so, I mean, one argument for the more unsavory parts of the Old Testament is that God had to use these things because that's the level of spiritual and moral development we were at the time. So he had, he had to use, and so.
Well, I mean, some of us.
Right, but that would be like that. I think that's analogous to saying, yes, I have to eat, but it's to what am I going to do with the fuel that it gives me? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, like I'm not like I'm just trying to understand this. I mean, were the Hebrews at that point in time were they the like cutting edge of humanity?
If you believe in the Bible, you have to believe that.
You have to believe that.
Yeah. But I agree.
But it's a crazy claim
I agree
when you look at the history of civilization.
Yeah. I mean, I personally want to give more credit to Zoroastrianism than it typically gets.
Well, that's what I'm just asking questions here. And of course they contributed something immeasurable. But like, am I to believe that given that we had sophisticated, psychological insights that I would say, have been transmitted into modern times,
right,
by alternate civilizations, are we to believe that this is the only answer?
Right, yeah.
I just don't know. I'm just trying to figure this out.
But I was just proposing like one possible Christian way of kind of dealing with that. I mean, another one that seems popular nowadays is just saying that the story was written by humans and so we got it wrong. God did not want the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. But I feel like that doesn't...
Well, I wasn't saying that.
I know, but I personally don't feel that does justice to the text. That's not...
Of course.
That's not what it seems to be saying. But I also don't identify as a Christian anyway, so I don't really need to defend it. You know what I mean?
You're absolved.
Yeah. But I do think it brings up interesting questions, because that's the way that sacred history unfolds throughout the Bible, is that it is more, let's say, violent to begin with, and it's more united with what we would see as more rough and primitive customs, and then it becomes more spiritualized, ultimately through to the New Testament, to Jesus, to Paul. Even if we talk about sexuality, right? Obviously, you know, Abraham has concubines? Yes, Abraham has concubines.
Yeah.
You know, that's pretty normal. And then eventually at some stage before the New Testament, you get, you get monogamy. And then you get Paul saying, you know, people like to say Paul's a misogynist, and maybe there's elements of that. But, you know, he does say there's a certain equality between men and women in marriage, right? Like the double standard of, let's say, Greco-Roman monogamy does not apply to Pauline Christianity. It's not like the man can have...
It's a feminist movement.
Well, some people would argue that. Now, again, I don't think that that's fully present in the text, but I think it is quite clear that neither the man nor the woman...
I need you to cut these references to the misogynist Paul.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take that out. We don't want to...
I don't want to be associated with Paul because I might get cancelled.
Yeah. We're going too far straight.
No. But look, I mean, I think I left a kind of cliffhanger earlier.
Yes.
I feel like to affirm fate requires love.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of in Nietzsche, even if he doesn't lay it out explicitly. And I think that's in Weil, even if she kind of focuses on submission, abnegation, almost self-destruction, whatever you want to call it.
But the key thing for you is to accept fate. Well, not accept, but affirm. Would you use the word affirm? Because I feel like Nietzsche would use the word affirm.
Yeah, affirm, yeah.
And I feel like Weil might, if she was pushed, use the word affirm.
Yeah, but I think the way you overcome that, or the way you transcend that, or the only way that makes any sense is if you're able to love. If you're not able to love, then it's everything that everybody says about it, right?
Yep.
Is it
okay,
not?
That's good. I like that.
This is my view.
Love is the key here.
Yeah. But that's what I see in Nietzsche.
You see love.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do too, to a large extent.
Yeah, and look, I'm not even... Yeah, I mean, this is my view. And... But I realize this is going to be an unsatisfying view to someone who's listening. It's going to sound absolutely incoherent because it's kind of mystical, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, like look at how Nietzsche's ideal. You know, if you want to understand this, I mean, to a large extent, he was. You know, people don't understand. People think Nietzsche was like this radically out of time, anachronistic individual.
Yeah.
That's true to some extent.
Yeah.
But he was also part of a movement. And this is a perennial movement that we always come back to, which is this kind of attempt to return to a very unusual way of living and interacting with the world, which probably originated in the Mediterranean in some sense, right? You know, I think Nietzsche was part of that. I think.
Do you mean the Greek way, or what are you referring to?
Well, yeah, it's a little broader than that, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, basically, and I think Germany at the time that he was writing was somewhat receptive to that, but it was also tipping over into something which we're now living through.
And how would you characterize it? Like the way that I see him thinking of the Greeks is this kind of celebration of existence, including its dark aspects. Like, is that kind of what you're alluding to? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think, but I think it's a kind of lightness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I think that existed in a lot of classical civilizations.
That actually perfectly helps me to seg into my next question, because it's
Yeah.
about the aesthetic,
Yeah.
right? So, what Nietzsche admired about the Greeks was their aesthetic capacity, which is also, especially in The Birth of Tragedy, the ability to encompass tragedy, suffering, death within that, and face it, and also bring out its aesthetic quality so that it's livable. I mean, so let me get to the question. So in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche states, only as an aesthetic phenomenon are existence in the world justified to eternity. And there's a couple of places, at least in the book, that he emphasizes that it's only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence in the world are justified to eternity. So what are your thoughts on this? Is there a sense in which the aesthetic is more important or more primary than the ethical?
Yeah, I think I actually agree with that. I think the ethical is bounded by human societies.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Like it's constructed, or?
You could say that, or at the very... I mean, I don't know that it's actually constructed. I wouldn't perhaps... I'd perhaps give it more credence than that, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
I think it precedes our perception of having a self, but in a sense, it's just the superstructure that allows that. Whereas, as I understand the aesthetic, it actually is the out. The aesthetic, or I mean, it's it's the out, or it's the entrance into something else. Maybe it's just the very beginning of something else. Maybe that's the maybe that's the transcendent. But at the very least, it's the thing which allows us to be more than biological.
Fascinating. Okay. So for you, ethics is the ethical. It does, like you say, it precedes the human self. So it's, in that sense, it's foundational, fundamental.
Well, I feel like I should say, because I don't know how this comes across, but I have nothing against the ethical. I accept the ethical. I accept justice. As a human reality. I think we should give it its due. I mean, I absolutely accept ethical judgments as having a validity.
Yes.
Like, are they the ultimate reality? Not in my opinion.
Okay, that's good.
Not in my perception.
Yeah.
Is God ethical? No. Is beauty ethical? No.
Good. That's perfect. Because it really draws out the differences and the distinctions, right? So yes, you're not.
And how could they be?
You're not a complete amoralist. You're not just saying the ethical is nothing.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I'm like I'm very messy. I'm not. Yeah. Like
the ethical has a fundamental relationship with humanity, but it doesn't have a fundamental relationship with reality. Let's say, like, it's not what reality is based on. Is kind of what you're getting at here.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Like, I wouldn't want. Look, put it this way: the human experience, the human drama, without the ethical, is nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But is there something deeper than that? I believe so.
And we can characterize that as the aesthetic, maybe.
Perhaps.
Or at least it gets us closer.
I think it's a little closer, yeah.
It seems to embrace more, and this is partly why I asked this question, because that quote by Nietzsche seems intuitively true or insightful. And I admit that somewhat begrudgingly, because I would like it for the ethical to actually be fundamental. And I'm also not denying that. I'm just saying that I can't fully understand that right now.
Yeah, but isn't that just part of the kind of friction of human experience?
Well, it's difficult. A lot of very intelligent, admirable people would identify the ethical as the basis of reality, and also generally combine it with the aesthetic, like we said before, that these transcendentals kind of merge. But yeah, there is a difficulty in talking about it, and for me, it's all to do with this overall problem of justice and the violence of life. The aesthetic. So in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche uses this example of dissonance in music. Like how can the aesthetic encompass suffering, death, pain, etc.? Well, look at dissonance in music. We actually enjoy it. But, of course, it's within a certain overall context.
Oh, we love it.
Yeah, and we love it. We actively enjoy it. And so there's a really...
I mean, look at music now.
Well, yeah. It's
No, I mean, like, actually, a lot of it is rhythmic.
Yeah.
Which is referring to something much older,
And your musical background is obviously
no comment.
Yeah, sorry.
No, but
Yeah.
No, I mean, like, I think as Westerners...
Yes.
We injected that where it wasn't necessary, where
Yes.
we had a perfectly...
Yes.
Perfectly
melodic, nice.
We had nice music.
Yeah.
We were very good at music.
Yeah.
We had to inject dissonance.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. And yet it still remains beautiful. I think people would hesitate to use that word, but I think I use beautiful just to mean aesthetically pleasing, like aesthetically... even pleasing is perhaps a bit base, but you know what I mean. Inspiring, aesthetically inspiring. Dissonant music can be that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but this is one of the reasons I love The Birth of Tragedy, is because he's still got that Schopenhauerian bent, and we've talked about this before. Schopenhauer's views on music, I think, are one of his most interesting insights. That music is a window into the nature of reality itself. Like the will.
Well, look, on Schopenhauer, I would just say... I mean, I can't comment on Schopenhauer. I think he's a genius. Is his temperament like the correct orientation towards existence? I'm not so sure.
Nietzsche perfects Schopenhauer, maybe.
Maybe. But, like, as an author, like, has he been bested? For me, no.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like, the aesthetic enjoyment that I derive from his writings is, like, I can't think of anyone else that, I don't know.
And one thing that I really enjoyed rereading The Birth of Tragedy recently was just seeing how much Schopenhauer comes through.
Yeah, and early Nietzsche is essentially an extension of that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But you can already see he's trying to feel for a different way. He's trying to feel for an affirmation of life rather than a denial, but he's using the Schopenhauerian metaphysics, and to a certain extent maybe the language as well, in some of the ways that he's writing. But in any case, so how can the aesthetic encompass what we would see as the negative parts of existence, the suffering, the death, just like music can encompass dissonance. And what's great about that analogy is it's so pregnant. Like, it's something that almost everyone can, as long as you can enjoy music, you can actually understand that.
Yep.
You don't need someone to break it down for you logically and kind of spell it out for you intellectually, because you get it, right? So in that sense, it seems somewhat true. The aesthetic can encompass more than the ethical. The ethical is, about it's about drawing hard lines ultimately, right? It's like, it's affirming one thing and condemning another. The aesthetic has more of a sense of affirming everything, and yet I want to qualify that a little bit, because the aesthetic is still something that modifies reality or interprets it, right? It's not just sheer reality itself, probably, at least.
But don't you get the kind of ghostly echo of Weil in that?
Yeah. And like I
mean, doesn't she say, apprehend things aesthetically, if you want to put it that way, or passively?
Yes, she does.
As opposed to this ethical action which transforms things, makes wrong into right.
Yes, She does. She definitely
Isn't that her
emphasizes-
path to God? Isn't the aesthetic, if you want to put it that way, her opening to God?
What's interesting about Weil, though, is it's so united to the ascetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is not so clear, at least, or obvious with someone like Nietzsche. More clear with Schopenhauer, to be honest. But you also have to acknowledge that Schopenhauer didn't act on that, maybe, as much as Weil did. It was more theoretical. His idealization of the ascetic, not aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, look, I can't speak for those people because I'm not an ascetic.
No,
I don't.
but you are an aesthetic, maybe.
Maybe, but look, I don't know. Maybe they have an insight that I don't have. Maybe they have a path forward that I don't have. Other than that, I don't think it's relevant to our discussion. I think there's such a thing as being...
You don't think that the ascetic is relevant to our discussion? Is that what you're
Correct.
saying? Yeah.
I think you can be receptive. You can be passive, if you want to put it that way, to the aesthetic reality of creation. Without being an ascetic.
That's more how I would actually read Nietzsche. Is actually
I absolutely
Yeah.
read him that way.
Yeah.
I mean, what was his life? Was his life debauched hedonism? Absolutely not.
No, but it wasn't ascetic. Well, maybe it was a little.
No, it wasn't.
bit,
But I think the ascetic.
he wasn't aspiring to that. Either.
Yeah, no, and I don't aspire to it either, and
Yeah.
I wouldn't prescribe it to people.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I'm not claiming any insight here. I mean, people who can achieve great ascetic kind of ends. I mean, that's something I can't do.
But there is a sense, like we talked about before, where beauty can overwhelm and even undermine the ego, the individual ego. And actually, and this probably unites quite well with Weil's thought, right? That the beauty of the universe, of which you're a part, could potentially have that effect if you could see it. If you could see it. But to see it is also to see the violence of the universe as well. And your own imminent death in the grand scheme of things.
Well, do you think it's to accept the violence of the universe?
Well, that's the question, because then it comes into conflict, potentially at least, with the ethical. I think that the Hindu view is very interesting, and this is something I also talked about in my article, in my video, is that the idea of Shakti or of Kali, or just generally, I mean, this doesn't have to be tied to a particular goddess manifestation of the divine, but the idea is that the universe is God's divine play, lila. And so...
Well,
what's fascinating to me is that's an aesthetic, highly aesthetic ideal. You could lift that right out of Schopenhauer or Nietzsche.
Yeah, because the Western view on this is problematic from this perspective. You could even say it's neurotic because, if you're kind of like a mainline Christian, there's the implication that some kind of transformation is imminent, or it's going to happen in a generation. Yeah. Even if you're a total secularist, you think full communism is going to be achieved in 70 years, right? Yeah. And that's essentially the Western view, regardless of which strain you belong to. Yeah. The Eastern view, if I can be extremely broad and crude that, posits our current ethical dilemmas, which I accept, I give credence to, they're human, but it posits them in deep time, which makes them essentially irrelevant. Morally, they're not so significant. Get over it. I believe that is the Hindu view, and Buddhism, I mean, is off the charts as far as that goes.
Absolutely. And even when you talk about deep time, I mean, ultimately for Hinduism, what that means is cyclical time, which actually removes the significance almost entirely, it still exists as a phenomenon that we periodically go through, but it's not messianic. It's not a linear linear
Yeah,
progression.
in Christianity, either the Messiah is going to arrive, you're going to be perfected, or you're going to, I'm using the term Christianity broadly, you're going to be materially sanctified.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Whereas, Hinduism is fascinating in that respect, and I kind of used it as one of the positions because it, like they clearly affirms the divine and transcendent realm, and some people actually are totally devoted to that.
Yep.
To the exclusion of all the other values, but it also acknowledges the immanent realm as being distinct and as having value of its own. And it's almost like a choice. You can choose between, do you want to stay in samsara? Well, that's okay. I mean, you have to bear the consequences of that, which is every action has a reaction, but you'll get suffering, you'll get enjoyment. It's almost as a subset of the Hindu worldview, there's the Nietzschean worldview. But then there's also the idea of, well, maybe you can break through to the actual ground of reality itself. And so the two are in a kind of harmony. But what you lose is that the ethical grounds reality, because ultimately the immanent reality that we experience is God's playful self-expression, or ultimately it's aesthetic. It's a kind of play. All the suffering that occurs has an aesthetic function for the divine. And obviously, I'm simplifying because not all Hindu theologies are like this.
No. But no, I mean, I think you're being pretty fair overall.
It's a broad brush, but yeah.
Yep. Okay, so does moralizing that suffering add anything? Does it give it meaning?
I think it can do for people, and I think that's the effect of Christianity in a lot of people. So maybe it's...
Do you think that's coherent? Because we need some of that suffering to get to where we're at, right?
How so? Do you mean
literally the procession of history requires...
Yes.
I mean, Christianity would be nowhere if it weren't for violence.
Yes.
I mean, it would be somewhere, but it wouldn't be where it is.
No, it wouldn't be where it is. No.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Do we affirm what furthers our self-regarding, compassionate view, or do we say it was all bad, but it was God's plan? Or, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, this is bringing the problem we're talking about, but just positioning it in time, right? But I agree. I mean, it is a difficult problem, and it ties back to what we were talking about before with regard to the annihilation of the Canaanites or whatever, or at least the command to annihilate the Canaanites.
Well, I didn't bring that up.
But you alluded to it, right?
Did I?
Oh, I assumed that what you were talking about. You said the elimination of an ethnos.
Oh, I did say that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are plenty we could choose from.
Yeah, but that's the big one that sticks out to a lot of people when they read the Bible, is that it seems like God is commanding you to...
Well, I don't even like what they did to the Egyptians.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it seemed unfair to me. I mean, we were doing great things. They were doing great things.
I thought you were a Yoruba, Kay.
No, I'm an Africanist in any sense.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm Negro-centric.
In any case, even within the story.
Yeah, but I mean, what sense does it make? I mean, they have slaves. They affirm slavery. There's slavery in every other context. Yeah. But their own enslavement, even though it seems like the most functional, most positive form of slavery. Yeah. Like, I'm going by the Bible here. Yeah. It's the one kind of slavery that produces all sorts of amazing monuments and...
Oh, you're talking about Egyptian slavery?
No, I'm saying with the Hebrews, the one kind of slavery they don't like is the slavery that gets everything done. Yeah. All their slavery, which is just like sex slaves, is good.
All right.
Leave that in.
All right, I'll leave that in.
No, but I mean, what to make of that,
Well,
like their slavery, which produces,
if we're
in apocryphal terms, produces... Yeah.
If we're gonna have slavery, it might as well be productive, and in this sense, productive, and in a
culturally
productive. Yeah, that is me. What's the word? Summarizing what you're saying. It's not a view that I necessarily hold. But I mean, my main point there was like Christians and Jews, for that matter, have to wrestle with this is the Bible. This is what the Bible seems to say and approve of. There seems to be a kind of linear progression, even if you're just Jewish, right? There's clearly a progression from the Torah to the prophets. Like,
well, I mean, I don't know if maybe you don't want to include this, but I would say Jews do not care about that. And this isn't me. I have nothing against Jews, honestly. But for obvious reasons, they do not care about that.
Well, that's not my experience anyway. But
we're all subject to a broader culture that we have to kind of defer to.
I think to take up the general point, right? The general point you're making is that if we look at this in the context of time, we can see that to get where we are today, whether as a religion or spiritual ethos, or as just biological beings, violence had to be committed in the past, right?
Yep.
And so what is our relationship to that? And Nietzsche would be of the position, affirm the past. Take responsibility for it, own it, affirm it. That is Amor Fati. That is the ultimate use of the will to power.
Yeah, I'm in line with that. I don't see that implies that I have to be violent, I have to be discriminatory.
No.
I don't think that it implies anything immoral at all.
Because you are what you are, and you are where and when you are. And of course you do have to be all those things to some degree, because life is not possible without them. But yeah, you don't have to do what others did in the past.
Yeah, but I mean also it's by its nature amoral. I mean, well, or it redounds to a different morality that doesn't have to do with just being harmless. I mean, my ancestors survived through adversity. Like that. I mean, this is a literal fact. It's not like No,
of course. Yeah.
Like I only exist because they survived adversity. I don't feel very comfortable with criticizing them.
No, fair enough. Yeah.
And like, I know that, I mean, that I don't think that's a very Christian impulse. But it's where I stand on that.
It's not a very Christian impulse not to criticize them. Is that what you're saying?
To criticize them, I think is... Yeah, not to criticize them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Christianity would say...
Criticize them.
You would have to say, well, we were wrong, but then at some point...
But look, now we've learned, like...
Yeah, but I mean, like... Actually, my ancestors were Christian, as far back as you want to go.
Yeah.
And they did what they had to do to survive.
Yeah, which means that you're here.
I'm glad that I'm here. Yeah.
And likewise with me, like,
because I'm, and okay, like put it this way, I'm glad that I can love.
Yes. I
mean, that's really the reason I'm happy I'm here.
You're here to love.
Yeah, I'm here to love.
Yeah.
Yeah. Life is worth living.
Yeah.
I love people, like, individually.
Yeah.
And I love life.
Yeah.
But how we got here, of course, politically speaking, you could criticize it.
Yeah.
But I won't personally,
Yeah. No.
So, I don't know. That's where I stand on that.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we've said a lot of interesting things about the aesthetic versus the ethical. For me at least, I haven't really resolved that, but I do see your point about it seeming that the aesthetic is more fundamental. It's not always, but for me, for a long time, it's had a kind of let's say that view that the aesthetic is more fundamental than the ethical. It seemed to me to have a dangerous possibility within it, which is to disregard the ethical. But of course, you're emphasizing that the ethical has its own validity on its own level.
I think the ethical has its validity. I do think that the aesthetic has... I think it is dangerous.
Because one way to sort of, I mean, this is obviously a very small part of the phenomenon, but, you know, one part of the Nazi phenomenon is the triumph of the aesthetic over the ethical, potentially. I mean, the aesthetic was strongly emphasized, and the ethical was at least made subservient to the aesthetic. Obviously, there was sort of ethics of Nazism.
Yeah,
but, you
no,
know,
that's interesting, though.
At least it was an ethos.
I mean, I'm absolutely not... I mean, I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah.
Do you think there was any value in it?
In Nazism? I mean, to even hesitate is already to cast myself outside of the bounds of acceptable thought. Yeah. But I am trying to give an honest answer. I mean...
I don't think this makes anyone look bad to say this. I mean, we're trying to be real about this.
I mean, even if I was to take completely the mainstream view, you could still say there was an immense value of Nazism because it's what we define ourselves against. It's the example.
Yeah, the mainstream view is worshipful of Hitler.
Well, it's the example in the sense of he is
in a negative sense.
In a negative sense,
but they love him.
Yeah, yeah.
Just the way that people love Trump.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's such a stupid thing to compare. Trump is like a
real
estate reality TV guy.
Yeah.
Hitler is a revolutionary that murdered billions, millions of people. Sorry.
I mean, obviously, not that it needs to be said, Hitler is morally abhorrent, but is he? But this brings out the question. I think is he in his movement aesthetic and aesthetically stimulating? I think that if most people were honest, they would say yes. I mean, people do actually like the aesthetics of Nazism. It has a certain glamour and appeal.
Yeah, even liberals who are rebelling against restraints on free speech, on expression, have turned to Nazism. Obviously, it's out of fashion now for reasons which are too complicated to get into. But, I mean, like punk rock appropriated that aesthetic as a way to say... you can't constrain us using moralism.
Yeah. But that would be a good example of where placing the aesthetic over the ethical is potentially dangerous. And I do see some validity to that line of thought. And then I think, and this is a very different case because we're talking about a social phenomenon, and then I would say the other thing is sort of the individual phenomenon of just the kind of... hedonistic aesthete who doesn't, take people's feelings very seriously, and there's always, I think, that tendency of, I mean, if after all it's just about the aesthetics of experience, the morality isn't very, very important. And obviously, Kierkegaard situates the aesthetic, and maybe he means something a little bit different. I'm not sure, but he situates it below the ethical, but he doesn't make the ethical ultimate. It's still subservient to the religious. But there seems to be something compelling about that as well, of the sense of like...
I'm sympathetic to that because, I mean, I don't want to be painted into a corner as being the partisan of the immanent or the partisan of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
The religious, maybe that gets at what I'm referring to.
Right, I think that's...
Because I'm just saying that the ethical is not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, because...
And that is not how we approach reality.
And in Kierkegaard's schema, right, the religious is the thing that transcends the ethical, and you're talking about the aesthetic in as much as it transcends the ethical, and in fact transcends, let's say, immanent reality. So really, maybe we're talking about a kind of combination of the two there. Because... for Kierkegaard, it seems to have more of a connotation of interestingness, or that kind of sense. But really, you're talking about something profound, something that overwhelms and maybe helps you see beyond things as they are.
Yeah, but I also think it's very primal. I mean, that's earlier I referenced like. Someone like Weil is from a very refined upper class background.
Yeah.
Or, whatever you want to call it, bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
goes into factories, goes into the Spanish Civil War or what have you.
Yeah.
She doesn't know what to make of it. She's wrong about the way people really are.
Yeah.
I wasn't doing that to mock normal people. I mean, like, I am a normal person.
Yeah.
I think that they're in touch with something which is valuable.
Mm.
I think that kind of...
Normal people are.
Yeah. I think the naive perspective on life actually is potentially closer to a deeper reality.
Everyone can love, right? That would be the unifying
Well,
thing.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah. You don't need to be an intellectual to
no,
love.
I don't. Yeah, I don't reify intellect that much at all. I think that's almost like one of the failure modes of our current civilization. Put it this way. Overall, I think there's a danger posed by the fact that we're potentially becoming stupider.
Yeah.
Maybe historically we've produced more intelligent people.
Yeah.
I know that's...
Because intelligence is important.
Intelligence is important for the maintenance of civilization.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe people think we're getting more intelligent or that we're producing more intelligent people. I actually don't think that.
Yeah.
I think that's a genuine problem. But do I think that the intelligent, harmless, docile person is the ultimate ideal? Absolutely not.
No. Or the extremely intelligent person with no love in their heart, right? Like,
well, yeah, no. I mean, I have a lot more time for the savage.
Yeah.
And I have a lot more time just for the normal person who has normal sentiments about life.
Yes.
Because I don't find those to be insufficient.
So this is maybe a good bridge to my next question, which is the contemporary view about the relationship between, immanence, transcendence, justice, violence of life. So my thesis is that there isn't a clear, coherent position. It's just a confused one. The way I see it, there's socially, generally speaking, we're maxing out on the concern for justice in itself. That's how people at least talk, and I think that's pretty much how people think, even if they don't think through that concept. We're maxing out the concern for justice in itself whilst also denying the transcendent, which to me is where the only place you could locate justice in itself, right? We can't deny the inherent violence of life, yet we're also unwilling to declare life evil and abolish it. So we can't take maybe it's unfair to call it the Tolstoyan position, but maybe the Schopenhauerian position, or I think more modern analytic philosophers have actually argued for that, right? Like anti-natalists and stuff. I just don't read them enough to know their names. But let's say that
what's that guy, Bennett?
Benatar?
Yeah.
The
South African guy.
I've heard that name actually. Yeah. So, but generally, that's a fringe view. Most people wouldn't hold that view. We know that life is inherently violent. Well, because most people still have at least one or two children, right? Like we're not, or they don't kill themselves.
Depends who you're talking about.
It does, yeah. Well, maybe ordinary people do a bit more than intellectuals, I think. But anyway. My point is that, so we've got these contradictions. We try and hold two sides at the same time. So would you agree with this description, or do you think it's not accurate?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I expressed this clearly earlier, but I don't really think that this concern for justice is
genuine.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I think justice is mostly vengeance.
Yeah.
Mediated through a kind of complex social game, which I don't object to. I think it makes sense. It's useful.
Let's take a topical example, and let's just take the example. Sure. A lot of people are talking about Israel and Palestine, and generally the sentiment in Western countries is among ordinary people at least is that they're very much for Palestine, and they're very much against Israel's bombing and attack and war against Gaza Strip. So, and a lot of people have no connection to either side, but they feel this sense of righteous
Yeah, but-
indignation,
okay, yeah.
or they have a sense that justice is not being done, a great injustice is
But
being
then
done.
some people are pro-Israel.
Some people
Like
are
quite a lot of people.
some people are pro-Israel.
Like probably an entire kind of
And I would say that
side of...
I would say that they also have similar sentiments, but I want to bracket them at the moment just because to me the motivating forces of the pro-Palestinian side it's a bit more clear to me, and in terms of the sense of justice, because at the moment, at this point in the war, I'm trying not to take it too much of a strong position or be controversial, but it seems at this point in the war, the Palestinian people are on, they're the side that is being harmed most directly, right?
Well, obviously.
Yeah. So that's what I'm trying.
There's no
It's
no
not
question about
it's
that.
not a particularly controversial statement.
No.
Yeah.
Well, it's literally a factual statement.
But that's
why could anyone really?
But that's why I picked that side, because I think that's the sense of justice and injustice motivates people who have otherwise have no connection with this conflict.
Yeah, but is that
go out and protest and put up posters and do whatever? So
I don't know. Is that a good example?
Are they being inauthentic? Like what?
Well, I think Palestine, for a lot of these people, is a proxy for their own.
Okay, this is good. Yeah, we'll talk.
Is it
about
not?
that. So we're talking about like culture war stuff, basically, like that.
No, I think it's a proxy for their own resentments.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay.
Is it not?
So sort of cultural resentments, personal resentments, all of the above? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. They certainly wouldn't see it like that. So we'd have to sort of say this is the unconscious.
No, look, I think it's totally legitimate to just be opposed to slaughter of harmless civilians.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, but wouldn't you say?
I think that's an aspect of it. Is just like nobody likes.
Yeah.
Nobody likes to see violence against people who can't defend themselves.
Yeah. But
I have no objection to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's true.
And I guess you could say that something like...
That's what this is as well. Let's just be honest.
Well, certainly if we're talking about... I don't want to make... this is an example, so I don't want to go too much into the issue itself. But yes, we're seeing...
I think it was the wrong example.
We're seeing innocent people being killed. I think that's a non-controversial statement.
Yeah.
And a large amount...
Essentially out of revenge.
That would be a further interpretation, but sure. If you're looking...
how else can you...
If you're looking at innocent people being killed... That inspires a sense of it. This is unjust.
Yeah.
And we want justice here, right? Or is that not fair to say? Is it more like that immediate compassion that you see when you're walking by someone who's getting beaten up or robbed or whatever the case may be?
I think it's a little more like that.
It's a little more like that. So we are idealizing it too much if we talk about it being sort of this transcendent justice that comes in and...
Well, look, I just don't care about people's opinions about what is ultimate justice, and the kind of people who would be most vocal about this probably aren't insightful about the most just possible outcome for the entire world, right?
Well, part of what I'm saying is that people aren't thinking these concepts through very far, but I am also maintaining that they're motivated by, let's say, justice. Like this is a word that usually attached to the word social, but this is a word that is incredibly present in popular discourse and seems to be, at least on the surface, incredibly motivating to people.
I think the violence is motivating. I think watching children, women, unarmed people be killed is motivating. Do I think it's a matter of justice? Yes, because we have a concept of justice between nations.
Yeah.
This clearly is superseding that in some sense.
Yeah, and you, like we said, you acknowledge ethics. It exists in the human realm.
Oh, yeah. This is not necessary.
Yeah.
This does not serve a purpose.
Right.
The deaths, the suffering of these people isn't legitimate from a human justice perspective. So yeah, I think people are aware of that. But are people consistent? Do people apply this across all cases? No. Do I blame them? No. These issues are driven by media. There are like internecine conflicts.
I want to move a little bit further into this because like we're talking about international conflicts, which is something that's always been occurring among humans. It's nothing new. What is new is the level of our technology, and so I did talk a little bit about transhumanism. So obviously there's different strains of transhumanism. There's even a kind of Nietzschean transhumanism, which doesn't care too much about violence and just sort of wants to glorify human beings. But there's also a kind of what would you say? I don't know, like a fictive altruist kind of transhumanism, or a utilitarian transhumanism that would want to, let's say, eliminate suffering as far as possible. And that's quite interesting, like not just in human beings, but throughout all sentient beings. And that's really interesting for me because, again, it's like, okay, this is this Christian idea of transformation of material reality. In some sense, it seems to be within our grasp, at least in terms of eliminating suffering. Should we go there?
I don't think so. No, I don't think we should wirehead predatory animals to be
wirehead or genetically alter.
Yeah, no, I actually think they're good the way they are. Yeah.
Despite the immense suffering that predation.
It's irrelevant to me. Even human suffering is a little bit more complicated than that, Some human suffering is necessary. I mean, like, I wouldn't be the person I am without suffering.
No.
The people that I love and respect wouldn't be the people they are without suffering. I'm not saying that they should suffer unlimitedly. I'm not saying they should suffer for no reason, but I think we're lucky as human beings that we don't necessarily feel that we suffer for no reason, whereas maybe animals do, but I mean they don't care. So
let me sort of try and steelman that position, right? So maybe they would agree, and I think people do generally agree. Yes, obviously there's something positive about suffering. For instance, like building muscle involves a certain amount of suffering. It's not overwhelming, and it's got very positive consequences. And even to a certain extent, it's enjoyable, it's challenging, etc.
I think it should be enjoyable.
Yeah,
but I even think like adversity in life in general should be enjoyable on some level.
What if we were to distinguish between suffering like Vedas and affliction, and we should say that actually it's affliction that we should eliminate? Let's say just among, because I'm trying to steelman the position, just among human beings, we should remove any physical suffering as far as we are able, which is like, with all our technological capacity, we should remove any physical suffering that causes affliction.
Well, you mean affliction in Vay's sense?
Affliction in Vay's sense that compromises the sense of self. because
it's very important to our development. It's very important to putting us in touch with something.
It's important to our development
greater than mundane life.
It's important to our development in a very deep sense that transcends the psychological ego, though. That's the problem. For the person suffering that, it is simply evil and overwhelming and bad. Even for Vay at the factory or whatever, So it's tricky. I mean, she had two minds about this. She said you shouldn't actually, you certainly shouldn't bring it about. Now, obviously, not bringing it about is different than eliminating it or not. But you would stand firm on that. You would say that actually even affliction is integral to the human experience and, in a sense, is valuable as a gateway to the transcendent.
Well, I mean, I would say, should we recoil from that? I don't think so.
We would lose something, wouldn't we? Even in that.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not celebrating like drudgery of menial work. I don't have any sympathy for that.
Right, or even just, I mean, that was one particular type of physical suffering, but there's also all kinds of diseases that can generate immense amounts of pain that overwhelm people's ability to cope.
Yeah, well, I have no sympathy for that either. I mean, in the sense that I don't want those things to just exist for no reason.
And generally we eliminate diseases, and that's something that we do, but...
yeah. In theory.
Yeah, well, yeah.
We seem to just move things around. I don't know.
Right.
I mean, like, are we healthier now? I'm not so sure.
Right, yeah. But okay, I mean, I think you've addressed the question, right? Like the
yeah,
question...
would I try and eliminate, like, experiences that pierce our subjectivity, that pierce our ego? I wouldn't say so.
And we could include death in that basket as well, so that sort
of...
Yeah,
would I try and eliminate death? I don't think it would be my place to do that.
Yeah.
I don't think I could sign on, like, a political project whose aim was the elimination of death.
Right.
Or just suffering in the most general sense. For humans. Let alone
for animals.
Like for animals, because clearly that would mean the elimination of so many species.
Yeah.
Which I like.
Yeah. Or at least the radical transformation of many species.
Yeah, look, I mean, like, I would rather some humans suffer or get annihilated than the elimination of whole species, which I find valuable.
Yeah. Because, like, even if we're not talking about, like, eliminating lions, if we're talking about eliminating lions' predation, we are talking about eliminating lions. Like, there's no...
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But if it meant, like, people in some... You know, if it meant, like, we're going to, like, increase human activity in some area, like, tenfold, versus, like, lions will no longer exist. I don't know. What do you think about that?
So that's the dilemma, as if...
Yeah, like, there's some region that's, like, a redoubt for lions. Like, lions exist elsewhere, but this is, like, of particular importance to lions.
Yeah.
And we say, we just want more humanity. We just want more humans existing. You know,
I think that's a genuine dilemma.
Well, for me, it's almost not a dilemma. I don't have any... Okay, so you're talking about transhumanists and kind of, like... I mean, let me expand this. Like, you're also, I think, referring to, like, extropians and just utilitarians.
Yeah, a particular utilitarian
maybe
kind of
people,
transhumanist.
You know, there are utilitarians who think it's better to have vastly more people at, like, a lower level of human satisfaction and enjoyment, because, like, ultimately that's worth more because there's more of it.
Because
right?
There's more in quantity.
There's more in quantity.
Yeah.
There are people who make that argument.
Yeah.
I think outright it would be better to have less humans right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think there's too many humans already.
For the planet.
Yeah.
Sort of
for the planet. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a coherent position. Yeah.
I just think we're putting pressure on certain species.
Yeah.
Which I value.
Yeah, and I do think that nature has an intrinsic value, and to say that nature has an intrinsic value, unless, again, you're appealing to some sort of Christian future transformation, is basically to say it has value as violent. It has value as being what it is right now.
Yeah, I can't think of any, like... I can't even really think of any political argument for this. I mean, if the entire, like, collective humanity voted that they wanted more of themselves and, like, certain charismatic species, which I value, had to be destroyed, I would just say I disagree.
Kill the humans.
Well, if I was able to.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I would just disagree. I would just reject that democratic...
Yeah. Because it's going up against a basic value.
For me, yeah.
For you, yeah. No, fair enough.
I mean, I mean, I don't know, isn't it interesting? I'm a human being, yet animals... I would say animals were formative to me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recognize myself as a human being if I hadn't grown up venerating animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what to make of that, you know?
Yeah, no.
At any juncture, I would value animals over human beings. Some animals.
To an extent, though.
To an extent, yeah, of course.
Yeah, because obviously you still eat meat. There's a degree to which you know...
it's not like that at all. I just mean, like... the diversity and the beauty of specific animals.
Okay, I mean, so we're pretty much agreed there. I mean, obviously there is, like, I also would not Well, I guess I have more tension around this, but ultimately I would not want to, if I had the ability to eliminate suffering and predation among animals.
No, I actually think it's a pretty important question. I mean, like, because I'm curious, what, like, I mean, you're not a utilitarian.
No, I'm not.
Do you think that they're being rational at all? Do you think, or okay, that's perhaps.
Well, I think that
do you think they're like on the right track in any sense?
No, well, I think they're not taking all relevant values into consideration, and that's generally the problem with utilitarians, is they're just narrowly focused on essentially one value, right? Which is hedonic value.
So you're okay with constraining the expansion of humanity, if you want to put it?
I mean, ideally, if you can increase humanity and not threaten the existence of species, obviously that would be the ideal. Where they come into conflict...
I don't believe you can.
Right, sure. But, maybe you can export humans to Mars. I don't know. But in any case...
Well, I mean, is that...
Is that... are they still
Does
humans
Mars
on
not have any value?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean... Because then you talk...
I don't know how I feel about that either.
No, yeah.
I mean, Mars seems kind of scenic.
Right.
Maybe we should just leave it alone.
There's a value in just landscapes and inanimate things as well. Yeah. But I am a human, and I am sort of pro-human in that sense. Like I think that's quite natural. For instance, the question of AI, like AI versus humanity, I see the argument. I get the argument of, yes, this AI will be more intelligent than us. I'm talking general AI if it comes about. Yeah. Be more intelligent. Maybe in every way it'll be better than us. Maybe it will even be aesthetically, experiencing morally reverent AI. But it will render humanity completely irrelevant instantly.
So we should self-abolish in that case?
Well, no. My point is that would I want to stop that AI from coming about? Because it will, at the very least, render humans completely irrelevant, and at worst, destroy humans. And what value am I standing on if I do want that? Because that's my immediate response: is yes, I do want to do that. I don't want that to replace us.
But why not self-interest?
Well, exactly. As a human, I do actually want to defend the value of the dignity, the superiority even of humans. That's part of being a being, I think.
It seems legitimate to me. I honestly don't see a huge problem there. But I also don't see a huge problem in a particular human in a particular context saying, I don't need more of this kind of human.
Yeah.
I would rather tigers or what have you, lemurs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So that's transhumanism. Well, I'm being a little unfair.
No, look, I'm sympathetic to it in the sense of let's see what we can do with
what we have.
With what we have. Like, let's see what we can do with our own power.
Yeah.
My only issue with it is the ideology, really.
Yes.
I mean, the technology, I think, is interesting.
Well, yeah. And
it's the ideology that it could posit an endpoint.
Yes.
Because that would foreclose on the whole experiment and the whole interplay.
Yes. Yeah.
That's my only issue.
Yeah. And when I'm thinking of the question about, AGI versus humans, of course, part of me is also, there are other values at play, and there is the sense that, well, maybe this could just go into realms of thought and apprehension that we're just not capable of getting to as humans. It does have its own value. I'm not denying that. But then again, as a human, which is what I am.
But that's really interesting because I think at other points in this discussion, you're defending the idea that there's something that we can't fully apprehend that we need to defer to. Yet when we have something concrete that we're afraid might be in a sense greater than us, even just intellectually, your impulse is to defend humanity regardless of whether we're actually greater than it or more worthwhile.
Because on the one hand,
you could say the same thing about like God as a concept. You could say maybe God is real, but I affirm humanity against God because I'm a human.
Yeah, fair enough. That makes sense.
I think that's kind of the way some nerds who like AI think.
There is a tension there. The one difference that I think is key in that regard is that if we're thinking about God, at least traditionally speaking, God created us. We didn't create God. But in this case, it would be the other way around. So we still have a chance to stop this.
Okay. Yeah.
There's also an open question for me whether this AGI, if it comes about, would be godlike in a positive sense, or would in fact just be completely satanic. And, I think that there's a good possibility to just be completely satanic. I mean, there's a whole lot of open questions around this. I don't want to go into this issue because it's very, very big. But
I'm not like forcing you down this path either. But don't you think that the impulse to defer to like divinity as such has a similar problem? Because if there is a level of reasoning or of discernment which is greater than anything that you can apprehend, it's really not your place to decide whether something is satanic or not. For all you know, the conventional concept of God is satanic, but you have to defer to it.
Maybe. You might be right. And I think if we're living in a world where it's already come about...
No, but I'm saying that literally in relation, regardless of... artificial intelligence.
Well, do I believe that about God? No. But then. But
don't you think the same problem exists? You have to trust that God is somehow good.
You're right. You're absolutely right. You do.
But you have no proof of that. You have some evidence against it, perhaps from a human perspective.
Well, the whole problem of violence being constitutive of reality.
Yeah.
I agree with you. That is a problem. That is a problem. And so essentially, ultimately, I think you have to have faith.
And yet you don't think that you're required to make that leap of faith with regards to like other superhuman forces.
Again, I think that would be having a different discussion, and ultimately an irrelevant one, obviously, if AGI was already here. But I think the key difference is, again, that this is something that is clearly a creature. Like, this is something that's not only a creature, but in a way, at least, was created by us, or is going to be created by us. It's categorically different from... The only open question is, if we want to talk in a spiritual, transcendent way, is, does it have a soul? And then you can say, well, is that soul more important?
Well, it depends how esoteric you are when it comes to AI. It depends if you think it, in some sense, precedes...
If you're a complete materialist, it doesn't matter because we're just basically machines anyway. So it's just another kind of machine. But then I'm not...
Yeah, but even for like a kind of old school accelerationist, it's a bit more complicated than just we made AI.
No, I agree. And that's absolutely right. And for multiple reasons. We are not going to make AGI. It's going to emerge out of the neural networks that compose it, right? Because we don't program AI per se.
Wow, that's one way of looking at it.
We set up conditions from which it emerges or learns and emerges, right? So that's one sense, but then there's also the hyperstitious.
That's what I mean. It's like, because in that case it becomes closer to something like Christianity, where we seem to have had to take particular socio-historical decisions in order to bring about something which was supposedly inevitable. But again, from a Christian perspective, at the moment it becomes inevitable, we then have to trust the process.
And that's why it'd be easier to just avoid getting to that final stage. You know what I mean?
But you know what I'm saying is like it's a similar problem in a sense.
I see what you mean, yeah. Okay, so let's see. So we're nearly at the end here of our talk. Okay, I think I will ask this one. So regarding the issue of the relation between justice and life's violence, so all that we've been talking about, how do you think we can best move forward on this as a society? What changes in general worldview, as well as specific practices, if any, do you see as being desirable?
Interesting. I mean, overall, I have a certain indifference to this question.
And I thought you would say that, actually.
Yeah. Not because I just don't care about anything or I just don't think it's important, but just because I don't think that is how we've proceeded ethically, practically, previously in historical terms.
Yeah, you mean like just sitting down thinking, what should we do? Should we do
this? Especially collectively. I mean, what does that even mean? Yeah. We've never been in this situation where so many people have been like party, quote unquote, to this discussion.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, I'll just say, I think it's an absolute absurdity to have every single adult human being be party to this discussion, and then we're going to find some kind of like enlightened way forward.
Yeah, fair enough. So on the
No,
practical,
I think it's
on the
driven
practical
by-
level, yeah.
I think it's driven by force. I think it's driven by charisma. I think it's driven by beauty.
But where do you want it to go? Even if you're not going to be able to achieve that or secure that socially, but where do you want it to go?
Where would I want it to go? I think we, on some level, need to resume the project that we've aborted on multiple occasions of trying to reconnect where we sit currently with where we came from.
And what does that mean exactly?
So we've undergone like a long period of kind of conditioning and like Judeo-Christian value, but that is essentially undergirded by classical civilization, just by ancient civilization in general. Yeah. Just by, what that means. Like, this is something which is universally, like literally universally, like cross-culturally venerated. Like, pretty much every people have reference to something ancient, which was, in a sense, greater than them. I mean, I think that's such an interesting point that we kind of shy away from.
We've degenerated.
Well, I wouldn't. That's not even the way I would put it. It's just that, like, any given people, people are so diverse. People in such different circumstances almost all have a reference point. And the time scales vary here, but like they basically have an archaic reference point of greatness. Yeah. Of like a golden age.
And that's what we've lost, essentially.
Yeah, I think we're disconnected from that. I think we identify with it sometimes for like petty nationalistic reasons or out of like, I don't know, stupid kind of, it's something we can reference to score points, but like we're essentially disconnected from it. I wonder what it would look like to actually be identified with it.
I'd say that either we're now, I agree with you, like we don't have reference to the past as being this ideal, thing, but so we're either adrift, but I think often we're also looking to the future as that ideal kind of anchor or something like that, the whole idea of progress being that of course the past is worse than now, but the future will be brighter.
I think that's wrong because I think so many peoples now are adrift. Yeah. And unfortunately they're not great.
No orientation to the past and no orientation to the future, just sort of...
Well, they're nothing. Yeah. I mean, like, the people, I respect that. Yeah. They live their lives. They're exactly like me. Yeah. They live their lives. Yeah. But from the perspective of the past or perhaps the future, it has no significance. Yeah. It's like samsara. Yeah. Just go for no reason. Yeah. Yeah. Achieving nothing. Yeah. It's just like endless cycles.
So bringing back the past, and for the past, just to be clear, for us it's classical civilization. To bring back that veneration of the past, what would that bring to us?
I think it requires a capacity for blasphemy. Okay. That we don't seem capable of, or we seem to struggle with these days. And that it's not exactly veneration that's required, but will or desire to be like those people. And to do that, you need to kind of not be cowed by little stories about what was or what you should be. I think that's really what we struggle with.
And when we talk about blasphemy, we mean it in the broad sense, don't we? We're not talking about just blasphemy against the Judeo-Christian God, but we're talking
No, that's absolutely pointless at this point.
Yeah, because I mean, most people would sort of hear this and say, well, people blaspheme all the time. I blasphemed 5 times yesterday. But we're talking about blasphemy in terms of like the ideals that still control people and...
Yeah, which I think are rooted in
Judeo-Christian
in the West,
morality.
In the West anyway, yeah. And we've kind of imposed that on everyone else.
But you're saying break out of that, blaspheme that, but and kind of what's the word? Tap into your desire.
Yeah, break out of that in a way that honors your own ancestors.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that crazy?
So
I think that's the way. I think that's what we're struggling with. It's not like we're insufficiently humble. I mean, we're not humble. Like, I'll say that. But we're also not great. So where does it leave us?
That's a really good point, actually. We're not humble, but we're not great. And we're not humble, but we're not proud in the Aristotelian sense.
Yeah, I don't think we can...
this strange, awkward middle ground.
Yeah, I don't think pretending to be more humble than we are is going to, like, solve this. I think greatness actually requires a form of humility. Just to link it back to everything we've been discussing. I think... when you're truly when life or kind of the Godhead or whatever you want to call it is operating through you, you submit. It's a kind of humility in a way, even if you're like this dominating, consuming personality.
And what you're referring to there is really I can see how that brings someone like Weil and someone like Nietzsche together.
Yeah, I think that was understood by every person who's kind of like in touch with reality.
The will to power that we see in Nietzsche is looked at in a different aspect, a kind of grace, or a kind of submission to grace. That when you're in that state, then it's not clear whether it's you imposing your will on reality or whether it's a deeper aspect of reality working through you. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
And I think perhaps our ancestors at times were closer to that. They didn't see that distinction. You know? They weren't self-effacing.
Yes.
But you didn't have to educate them in the concept of humility in the face of fate or God or, you know? That was obvious to everybody.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of true, like, cross-culturally, interestingly. You know? I think that's kind of what's missing. There's like a strange... And there may not only be one. There may be multiple disconnects. Yeah, so I suppose that would be my way forward. Okay. I don't think it's that we just... You know, look, like, put it this way. I don't think we need to, like, double down on like steel manning our concept of social justice. I don't think that would do good at this point. Like, I think the people that are actually making progress on behalf of all of us are stepping outside of that.
Yeah.
That's basically where I stand.
Yeah.
I don't think we should, you know, as individuals, I don't think it helps us to engage with discourse about justice.
Yeah, good. I mean, we've come full circle. I mean, at the start, you know, with introducing the quote, and you said, actually, I just agree with that. I agree with Nietzsche's quote about justice. So what you're saying now is we really just need to stop fixating on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very useful socially. Like, we should acknowledge that. Maybe if we acknowledge that in a way that we didn't identify with it or like find ourselves in it in some petty, superficial way, maybe it would actually work better.
But it's not an ontological principle. It's not something...
I don't think so. Yeah. Because I don't think God is justice. Put it that way.
Okay.
I don't think the divine has an identity with justice.
And that's key.
If it does, it's a justice that it means something utterly different than what we mean by social or human justice.
And you've mentioned that before, and I think it's really good to clarify your position, because you're saying there is not an identity between the ethical and God. And that distinguishes you certainly from the Christian position, and from many other theistic positions as well.
Although I think it's kind of there at the same time. I mean, I think the idea of forgiveness is unjust.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically unjust. It
transcends justice.
You can't have a justice system based on forgiveness.
Right.
Like, what does that look like? It's impossible.
people talk about justice being balanced by mercy, but Christianity kind of already starts to dissolve the notion
True
of justice.
mercy dissolves justice. Yeah. Because to be truly merciful, you have to be stronger than anything that's happened to you.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
If someone's wronged you, even horribly,
Yeah.
frighteningly,
Yeah.
if you're powerful enough, you can forgive that person. Just, even in the sense that you just have you're not sucked into the idea of exacting revenge on them. I mean, your energy is elsewhere. You'd rather continue expanding, growing, living.
Even
why expend energy
Yeah.
exacting revenge on some petty being that's lesser than you?
Or even if they're bringing you to your death, you don't expend that energy through resentment and so forth.
Yeah.
Thinking about, obviously Jesus being the prime example in Western culture, and you also maybe thinking about like Al-Halaj. Is that the yeah, right? Like, I mean, I don't know too much about him, but the sense is that he was just he transcended the kind of petty human emotions that someone might feel when they're being condemned to death.
Yeah, I think you see that in Sufism. I think you see that in the saints. I mean, and you see it in Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't think Jesus was killed by his surrounding society.
You don't think he was killed by his surrounding society?
No, not really.
What do you mean by that, though?
I think it was a choice.
Right, it was driven by him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was both.
Yeah, it's a complicated question.
It was a fate that could have been...
But like, was it inevitable? No. He had plenty of options open to him.
Precisely.
He could have resisted in so many ways. He could have...
Yeah.
He
could have evaded, or he could have openly resisted. He had potentially a whole movement of people at his
His whole existence, in a way, made a mockery of justice in the way that we think about it.
Yes.
Because
he
just threw it back in the face of the state.
Yes.
In the face of officialdom, of social sanction.
Yes.
Yeah, like, have your justice, enjoy it.
Yes.
It's worthless.
Yeah, is it just for for his people at least to be ruled by the Romans? There's a sense in which he just transcends all these.
Well, I think he made a mockery of it in a way. There's something very playful and very,
exactly
ironic and sardonic about Jesus in a way.
Yeah, but I think that comes from his sense of identification with God, with the absolute. Now I'm speaking phenomenologically. I'm not speaking metaphysically, but phenomenologically it seems that
But don't we all have access to that in some sense?
Potentially.
Doesn't that occur in the outlaw?
Perhaps, in a way.
The outlaw who kind of accepts that they've identified with the fact that they're likely to die.
Yeah, perhaps.
But it's a free choice.
Yeah.
And they are going to playfully enjoy that.
Yeah. I mean, it seems there's a lot of power there in that acceptance of death, whilst not letting it corrupt you, make you resentful, make you rebel against existence.
Yeah, I'm not talking about people who don't like being alive or want to die.
Yeah,
I'm talking about people who actually love life.
Yeah,
but love life so much that they're not willing to let death cast any kind of shadow over
which
it.
Seems consistent with, at least for me, with the way that Jesus lived and expressed himself. It doesn't strike me actually that he wasn't ascetic. People made a point of pointing that out to him, is you're not like John.
Yeah.
You're not going out into the desert. You're actually drinking with people. And he was an ascetic. He seems to have genuinely enjoyed life, loved abundantly, right? And so it's he's not this nihilistic kind of denier of life at all.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Like do we really, or have Christians historically really aspired to that? Some have,
yeah.
And I think it's produced great things.
I think of G.K. Chesterton when I think of this kind of jolly affirmation.
Yeah. But I mean, even like more historically, I mean, I think there's I think the kind of early synthesis of like organic European culture with this kind of outside Semitic mythology actually produced amazing things which aren't particularly familiar to us. You know, they were much more life-affirming than what we think of as being like religion now. But, you know, I think we could be like that now.
Okay, so finally, and I'm aware this is a somewhat unfair question to ask, but how would you, briefly, summarize the purpose or meaning of human existence?
Purpose or meaning of human existence? Well, I mean, I think, you know, as a human, I can... I find that I apprehend it aesthetically.
Okay.
And even, you know, and like maybe some people would see that as limited. Maybe some people would see that as shying away from some kind of ethical dimension, right? But I feel like it actually requires a lot of... To even apprehend life aesthetically draws on like all the resources you have as a kind of, you know, as a human organism, which encompasses everything as far as I can tell, you know.
Because this is what it strikes me. So tell me if it's accurate to your view. To perceive life aesthetically means you cannot perceive it resentfully. You cannot perceive it as a victim.
Yeah, because
even if it is victimizing you, because you're actually transcending that in the act of perceiving it aesthetically.
Yeah, because to perceive it as a victim actually seems false to me. And I see that as being opposed to partaking of life.
Whereas, on the other hand, to perceive it ethically, potentially, and I'm not fully committed to this, but it seems that to perceive it ethically allows for that being a victim. I demand justice. Life is unjust. I demand my rights. I demand justice. And it can lend itself to falling into that antagonistic position in regard to life, which it seems is what Nietzsche was concerned to overcome. Now, Christianity posits ultimate resolution from that. Yes, you will have your rights, I guess, in a certain sense, or at least you will have what you will have. It's difficult because it's not, like we said before, it's not quite justice, it's more mercy. I mean, a true Christian position wouldn't say that you get your rights, it would say that you get the mercy and grace of God.
Well, depends who it's preaching to.
Right, yeah, right. But in any case, you get a situation where life is transformed and everything turns out perfectly. But in the aesthetic view, what you have is what is.
Yeah,
I
think
the dark, the light, the good, the bad.
And I think we're born into the resources that we have. I don't want to say that we should do anything. I don't want to say that we should forgive. I would say that
there's a paradox in that as well, in a way, right? You can't. Is it a duty to forgive?
I don't think so.
Because doesn't forgiveness imply a transcendence of duty?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I don't conceive of it that way, and I don't look at other human beings who I perceive as being these, beings with agency and think you should forgive. I am indifferent.
That would be. I mean, I get exactly what you mean, right? But I think that conceptually the whole thing breaks down if you're doing that. And and obviously Jesus said you shall not judge others. I think there's immense wisdom in that, because I mean, what are you doing if you're just looking at people and saying you're bad because you're not forgiving? You ought to forgive.
I don't have that sense at all. I think you will forgive, or you will exact revenge.
Or if you're looking at people and saying you should forgive, maybe you can forgive them for not forgiving. You know what I mean?
But that's what I'm saying. Is like you're going to navigate this the way that you can.
Maybe the question is, can you forgive existence itself? And the answer is maybe if you perceive it aesthetically. Maybe this isn't your position, but does it resonate with your position?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have no resentment against existence.
Mm.
I have no desire for completion or absolution
You don't
or
want
forgiveness.
to bring God into the courtroom like Job. You don't want to establish your rights and...
No, absolutely not.
If there is a God or there is a divine being at the heart of everything, I don't know. How do you feel about that? That maybe it's perceiving everything in this aesthetic fashion. Does it give you?
You mean how do I? If I were to say there's a God, how do I relate to that God?
Do you think about that though? Because I mean, obviously your God isn't quite. It's not identical with ethics and justice like the Christian God, but it's much more like, I would say, the Hindu God. I wonder, is it something you think about, that the idea that there is this being at the heart of everything, perceiving everything aesthetically?
Yeah, I think that's kind of like, I think that's just a human thing that comes up. But my relation to that is one of just worship and veneration and just total gratitude. I don't care.
Which is the appropriate response.
Well, that's just how I feel. I mean, I accept whatever God does to me, if there is a God.
It feels to me like that is the appropriate response.
I don't want to quibble with that or like create complex theories around it.
Even for Christians, there's something about God that, like you mentioned before, transcends morality, and not just in the sense of him embodying mercy rather than strict justice, but also in the sense of being the creator of this universe, and also in the sense of what you find in the scriptures and so forth, in terms of the more unsavory aspects. There is a sense in which, or I mean, the archetypal story of, or that maybe archetypal is not the right word, the prototypical example of Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice, right? God, that Kierkegaard made so much of, like this kind of like, it was right for Abraham to submit to God in that situation, although it was also ethically abhorrent or questionable.
I just think the ethics are mostly irrelevant.
Yeah.
I mean, like, look, I understand as a human being why, but like, I don't think we should fixate on that. I don't think it brings us closer to anything. I feel like the most genuine forms of prayer that I've made were answered completely and immediately.
Interesting. How does that tie into what we've been talking about, the aesthetic and so forth?
The aesthetic?
Was there a way in which you made those prayers that was different from how others might pray?
Well, yeah, I think they were. I think they were kind of supra ethical or supra moral. I guess you would say.
Okay.
I mean, I wasn't thinking of it in terms of like,
yeah,
you know, like make everything make sense, make everything good.
Yeah. So interesting. So you actually also suspect there's some efficacy in prayer?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I
would
don't
agree.
see why not.
I would agree.
Yeah, but I think it depends what you ask for.
Yeah. Well, and then, of course, in the Gospels, Jesus ends his prayer, well, his prayer before his death, at least, with "Your will be done, not mine." So
yeah, and that pretty
seems
similar.
A critical aspect, doesn't it?
That's pretty similar to the kind of prayer that I've experimented with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I mean that answers my question.
But you know that yeah. Look, all I will say is that is not an ethical position. You know, that's it's a kind of loyalty to something. You could put it that way.
Yeah,
it's a kind of well, it's love, really.
Yeah,
it's love of the world, or perhaps of whatever might be behind the world
Yeah.
and the way it's going to play out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's good. So we've got the aesthetic and we've got love. These are the two.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say much earlier, if there's a kind of cliffhanger, is I think Amor Fati and just or even in Wei's sense, like attention,
Yes.
passive submission, waiting for
Yes.
God.
Yeah.
I think that takes an immense amount of love.
Yes. Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it takes love not to, I really think this is operative in Nietzsche as well. I think it's very easy to destroy even the Dionysian mode through grasping at the world out of fear, out of doubt,
Mm-hmm.
out of jealousy, resentment, hatred, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot, and I think Nietzsche identifies this with the great people of classical civilization. It takes a lot to engage in the world, even on the aesthetic level, without, you could say vice, sin in some sense is the attempt to consume beauty when it cannot be consumed.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you see something is so beautiful, you want it, you try and take it, then you can't.
You can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Nietzsche understood this.
And
And it's definitely there in Weil.
yes, explicitly.
Yeah, explicitly, almost the injunction
Yes.
to sit still.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And passive is actually the wrong word, but I just, it's hard to find the words for this. But
Well, it's like Wu Wei, right? It's like
it's something that we don't
active
really.
passivity or something like that.
Well, it's receptivity. It's being open.
Yeah, being open.
Which isn't easy necessarily.
No.
It's much easier to just try and grab at everything that you see that satisfies you.
It's much easier to act. I mean, if I think about when I'm particularly anxious, right? There's
Yeah.
always the
Well, you
desire-
want to act to diffuse the anxiety.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
The hardest thing is just to sit, or you want unconsciousness, but the hardest thing, which is complete passivity, the hardest thing is to sit
Or sobriety. That's hard.
with, right.
You want to be intoxicated by, by the environment you're in.
Yep. But to
you
just
don't
attend.
want to perceive it directly because
Yeah.
it's overwhelming.
Absolutely.
I think Nietzsche struggled with that a lot.
Of course. Yeah.
And I think he does address it even if he doesn't want to refer to it directly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of my I basically follow Weil when it comes to prayer and so forth. I think prayer is
Attention is prayer.
well, yeah, and I think it's opening yourself up to
A higher
to the
will.
process.
Okay.
Yeah, to a higher will, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a frightening venture.
Yeah. It seems unavoidable in a way, and it seems very vain to think this way because it's like it's all about how you respond, but you're going to go, like, you're not going to exist forever. You're going to die. You're going to be your individual personality. Probably, I'm not committed to this view, but I tend towards the view that your individual personality is going to dissolve.
Yeah, I think in the strains of Christianity that I'm more sympathetic to, that occurs anyway.
And so it's all about your response now that you're alive and you're conscious to all those facts which are unavoidable. That makes the difference because you're not going to avoid them. And even if we had, even go back to the transhumanist question, even if you had physical immortality, it doesn't secure you actual immortality, So there's no escaping this.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that's the exact quandary that Nietzsche discusses. And it's almost, I mean, this may be going a little too far, but it's almost the problem that Christianity is addressing as well. It's almost what it's not arguing against, but trying to find a way out of, at least when it comes to the person of Jesus.
How so?
Well, in that I think this idea of forgiveness and love like basically radically undermines the clinging to life, I guess you would put it that way.
Yes.
You know, it kind of says like
the whole
I'm great, like I'm part of something greater than this. I'm not afraid. It's the non-fearful mode, which I find so fascinating about the figure of Jesus himself.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
You don't see it anywhere else, really.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like, that seems to be throughout the Gospels, and it's quite explicit. And don't be anxious. Like, don't be anxious for your life.
Well, I think the message of this is really going to put me in. This is really going to put me in like territory that isn't conventional, but the way I read it, it says like sin is harmless, Satan is harmless. Like, these might be real things, but they're essentially harmless. Like, you don't have to allow yourself to succumb to these things.
Satan can't touch you.
Yeah. And the solution isn't some kind of violent defensive resistance.
Yeah.
It's actually within you.
Yeah.
At all times.
I think that could well be consistent with an orthodox interpretation of Christianity.
Yeah.
I mean,
but coming from me, it sounds.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's what Jesus is always pushing for in the Gospels, and it's behind things like, don't stop to bury your father before you come to follow me.
And I'm not saying like be debauched, but I don't think Jesus I don't think Jesus as a figure in the Bible was particularly perturbed by mundane vice or the natural playing out of the human tragedy.
I think
he seems to show a kind of like beautiful, childlike indifference.
Yes, yeah.
Or a playful, like he solves it in these playful, almost absurdly magical ways.
And his parables actually, interestingly, use vice and use sort of shocking, amoral or immoral metaphors and things to get the point.
Yeah, well, they certainly use a kind of heresy.
Like, I'm thinking particularly of,
given his context,
the king who goes away and entrusts money to his disciples, and he's a harsh king, and so people don't like him, and so, you know what I mean? And then they're expected to multiply his money before he comes back, and like he uses all these interesting kind of amoral parables. But no, I mean, to get back to not to get too far adrift of that, but to get back to your point, I think that is, and this is also interesting and consistent with Scheler's view of Christianity, early Christianity as being this sort of exuberance that stems from, I mean, for him, obviously, and all Christians, it comes from God, it comes from grace and the Spirit inside you. But there is a sense of abundance and unlimitedness being united with God. Nothing can touch you, death can't touch you, sin can't touch you.
Yeah, that's how I feel. And look, okay, to relate to your other question, which I probably didn't really answer about what could we do now, so forth.
Yeah.
My answer is kind of naive and obvious in a sense, and maybe they had shades of this, and maybe Nietzsche had shades of this. I think we should not give excessive value and credence to things like money, or even ethics, if you want to put it that way.
Excessive credence.
Yeah, excessive credence.
We're not talking about abolishing ethics.
No, well, of course, it's necessary, but
it has a
But
context.
if ethics binds us to this kind of like quotidian, like repetitive form of life, which doesn't allow us to see something outside of it, then it's like, okay, like we can make concessions to reality, but we basically should be willing to step outside of that and be somewhat childlike and and be ignorant of the ledger of like who did wrong and who did right, and who's aggrieved and who's a perpetrator.
Including yourself.
Yeah, including yourself. Obviously, this can sound self-serving, but like, I basically think that's the way forward. And I think we see it every day. There are many, many people who we admire because they basically stand above that. Often they're artists or, not most artists, let me make that clear, but like, often that is the form it takes because that's one of the few realms of life that is given some kind of allowance to be like that.
Yes.
But everyday people actually are like this as well, often.
Yes.
Like everyday, normal, working class, middle class people that you meet are like good in this way that is so much more beautiful than like billions of pages and words of like ethical treatises. Yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
People that show genuine, immediate kindness without hesitation. Without feeling like it corresponds to a certain lack or deficit. Yeah. That's what I value essentially.
Right.
Yeah, I truly think that is actually power. I think those people have the capacity to be much more powerful than like someone who has all the errors and like...
Yeah, and that's why we can't talk about that act necessarily as being justice, because justice implies some kind of weighing up, balancing, calculation. Yeah. But I think it's different from... irrespective of calculation.
Yeah. I guess, and that's my other cliffhanger. So like my two kind of like points that I actually feel like I do have somewhat of an answer to is like, I think submission to fate, even in like the most brutal kind of amoral Nietzschean sense, is to do with love.
Yes. And
I think the kind of regular people that they tried to engage with, but basically failed at.
Yes.
I think they do contain something valuable, but...
And we love Vey, let's be clear.
Yeah, oh, yeah. No, I like totally. I think she did absolutely... She took it about as far as she could, given everything she had. I think she's like a truly great person. But
her failure to connect...
Well, I mean, she just didn't understand them, and that's understandable given where she came from.
Yeah.
But like, what is great about them is that they are afflicted? No, not in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I think it's actually their capacity for something more Nietzschean. I think it's their capacity to love without caring about it. I think it's actually their capacity to be common.
Yes.
Like with all that connotes, to literally just experience pleasure.
Yes.
Be generous.
Yes.
Without thinking about it.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's why I value them. Yeah.
That's really good. I like that.
Yeah. That's basically my perspective on this.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, like that being said, there are masses and masses of people who take great pleasure in kind of collective rituals of punishment and sadism.
Course. That's the dark side
of it. That's just part of life.
Yeah.
And like I make no excuses for that. And, we're often part of it, I think.
I mean, if you're going to affirm reality as it is, you affirm all of it. And then I guess within that reality, ethics exists. I'm kind of paraphrasing your worldview, but ethics exists. It has its place. It has its claims and authorities, but those claims are not absolute. And a better way of viewing the whole is aesthetically.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the way that everybody on some level approaches it.
Practically, at least.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's like when you talk about that procession that they saw.
Yeah.
I mean, like...
Yeah.
I don't think they were getting off on how much they were slaves.
No.
I think...
They were probably having a very... it might have been a...
I think they were sublimated. I think... Yeah. I mean, like, not they, but I think in general, what happens is the ritual consumes you, and you don't have to worry anymore about who you are and what you want and don't want and what you like and how you look and who you are.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of ritual. That's kind of the beauty of religion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well that's fantastic. I think that answers certainly the last question. I mean, I did say briefly, but to be honest, I also asked you a lot of questions.
No, but it was good.
No, that's good. That's good.
Anything else?
No, I think I have a good idea of your position on this. I mean, it doesn't fully resolve it for me, but it does give me a unique perspective, which is...
No, I absolutely think my position is not like some kind of coherent
it's not a
thing,
resolution.
and it's not...
Yeah.
It cannot be closed.
Yeah.
Like it cannot be like idealized. It's not Platonic.
Yeah. It's not a system. You can't prescribe it to someone.
Yeah, and like so maybe Christianity is like that if we're talking about Christianity as we understand it, Roman Catholicism.
Yeah.
Which really,
well, to be fair.
No, I mean,
or
like...
orthodoxy.
But I'm being serious. Like, I literally struggle to conceive of it any other way. I think that is the kind of culmination.
Yeah.
But I can absolutely see why someone cannot ultimately submit themselves to that, because it's like a closed system that tries to trim and, like, foreclose aspects of life.
Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think that's how... I think the beauty of like Catholic culture globally...
is that it breaks out of that, eh?
Yes, that it absolutely does not obey church authority.
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing in that sense. It's close to Hinduism.
Yes, exactly.
And that, like... I mean, look at Central Europe, like folk Catholicism. You have like some kind of like gory mystical crucifix in the middle of a field.
Yeah.
Or some saint.
Some saint that basically functions like a god.
Yeah. And that people worship.
Saint of death or something.
Yeah. And then you have all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
Like, I wouldn't want to constrain that or like so that's what I feel about that. Is like, it's good. Like, try, like, by all means, like, let's keep the church. Let's keep constraints. Let's keep authority.
But you don't have to be enclosed in them. You don't have to confine yourself to them. They exist.
I don't think anyone is.
No.
I think if you are...
Some people try to.
Some people try, but I think if you are, you're some kind of strange person who's approaching it from, like the peasants, the serfs, whatever you want to call them. Those people are not constrained by this. The intellectuals...
They
can be. They're often not, but sometimes they attempt to be. But that is really, to me, the most insane position. The person who has freedom and tries to give it up.
Yeah.
Because, like, I think freedom is... I mean, like... Yeah, I mean, I think... Doesn't freedom have something to do with divinity?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, you know?
Yeah.
Like, to voluntarily try and sacrifice it.
Yeah.
Is just crazy to me.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up on that note. So it's been about
good.
Well, it's been a long talk anyway.
I'm sure we can cut some.
I'm not sure how much I'll cut it down. I have a feeling I'll actually keep it all. But anyway, it's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, for any
really
listeners, this is a kind of conversation we have quite a lot. So, or at least in terms of this level of depth and in this level of, for me at least, delving into really interesting topics. So maybe we'll do a different one at some stage about a different topic.
Yeah, I think we could perhaps perhaps even just like a passage of someone that, because I feel like with these were more your questions, and so like...
Well, I could actually have you turn it around on me, to be honest, and maybe you could ask me something and we could do it that way.
Yeah, that could be good. That could be interesting.
You could grill me on something.
Yeah, no, but I feel like I'm I'm very via negativa when it comes to this.
Yeah.
Like, I totally accept the answers we come to, or well, not even that. I accept the mystery.
Yeah.
But my default mode is to approach it negatively.
Fair enough, and that seems very much true to my experience of
out of pure humility, almost.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't know what to say about anything else.
But for anyone who's actually listened this far, thank you for that. I hope you've got something out of it.
Thank you.
And if you have any insights, any questions or any challenges that come up, feel free to throw them in the comments. or even if you want to go as far as making a reaction video or a response video, that'd be cool. I'd try and respond to that and engage with that. But yeah, so that's us.
Thanks.